Silas Vane didn't flinch when they told him Warren Pike was dead. He smiled. Not the all polite kind a man wears at a funeral. A slow, satisfied smile, the kind that lives behind closed doors, the kind that tells you everything about who a man really is when nobody's watching. He straightened his coat, picked up his whiskey, and said, "Well, that's a shame." And nobody in that saloon said a word. Because in Briar Hollow, Colorado, in the fall of 1876, Silas Vane's smile was the last thing a person wanted to argue with. What nobody knew, not yet, was that a young woman had just stepped off a westbound train carrying one battered trunk, $17, and a letter confirming she was about to become Warren Pike's wife. She had no idea the man was already in the ground, and Silas Vane had no idea she was about to become the most dangerous thing he'd ever underestimated. If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly the kind of viewer we made this for. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Because the stories we tell here don't let go of you easily. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And please, leave a like. It tells me you're still here. Now, let's go back to where everything began. The train was 40 minutes late pulling into Briar Hollow, which meant Eliza Whitmore had spent those 40 minutes sitting rigid on a wooden bench, watching her reflection in the dark window glass and rehearsing, for what felt like the 100th time, how she planned to introduce herself. "Good evening, Mr. Pike. I'm Eliza. I know the letters were formal. I hope we can speak plainly from the start." She'd written that line on a scrap of paper back in Ohio and worn it smooth from folding and unfolding it. She wasn't a vain woman, but she'd pressed her best gray dress that morning and pinned her hair twice. She wanted to look capable, settled, not desperate. She was, in fact, desperate, but she'd gotten very good at not looking it. Eliza had turned 24 that August, and the year leading up to that birthday had stripped away nearly everything she'd depended on. Her father had died of a lung illness in January. Her mother had followed him in April. Grief more than sickness, the doctor said, as if that was supposed to be comforting. The schoolhouse where Eliza had taught for 3 years handed her position to a man by June, because the school board decided, very politely, that a woman alone wasn't a stable enough presence for children. What they meant was she was poor now, and poor women made people uncomfortable. The letters from Warren Pike had started arriving 2 years before any of that. A mutual acquaintance, a cousin's neighbor, something like that, had made the introduction. Eliza had written back because Warren's first letter was different from what she'd expected. He didn't describe his cattle count or his acreage the way the other correspondents she'd seen did. He'd written about the color of the sky over the Colorado mountains at dawn and said it made him feel small in a way that wasn't frightening. She'd liked that. They'd written back and forth for nearly a year. He was plain-spoken and a little awkward and honest about the fact that ranch life was hard and isolating. She had been honest back, told him she wasn't romantic about frontier living, had no illusions about its difficulty, but had never been afraid of hard work. They had agreed, cautiously, and with a surprising amount of mutual respect, to try. When her mother died and the school board let her go, the agreement became something closer to necessary. She had packed everything she still owned into one trunk and bought a train ticket west. And now the train was pulling into Briar Hollow in the dark, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was telling herself to breathe. The station platform was nearly empty. That was the first thing that caught her. She had expected Warren to be there, had imagined it without meaning to, a broad-shouldered man in a hat, waiting. Not dramatically, just there. The platform had 2 lanterns, a station master in a wool coat, and a dog sleeping against the far wall. Eliza stepped down from the train carefully, because the step was higher than it looked, and picked up her trunk herself because there was nobody offering to help. She stood on the platform and looked both directions and told herself not to panic. He was late. Trains ran late all the time. She had just spent 40 minutes being late herself. She approached the station master. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for Warren Pike. He was supposed to meet me here. I was expected." The station master was a thin man with tired eyes, and the way those eyes shifted when she said Warren Pike's name told her something was wrong before he even opened his mouth. He took off his hat. People only did that for certain kinds of news. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm real sorry. Warren Pike was killed 2 days ago." She heard the words, she understood them individually, but they didn't stack into meaning for a moment. just hung in the cold air between them while the dog shifted against the wall and the train began hissing steam behind her. "I'm sorry," the station master said again, quieter. "There was a dispute. Over water rights. It got out of hand." Eliza stood very still. She was aware, in a detached way, that she should probably sit down. Her legs felt like they'd been drained of whatever kept them working, but there was nowhere to sit except the bench against the wall, and walking to it felt like an enormous undertaking, and she didn't want to do it in front of this man who was looking at her with such uncomfortable pity. "What do I do?" she said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. It was the kind of question you asked yourself, privately, in the dark. But it came out of her mouth before she could stop it, and once it was out there, it felt honest in a way that embarrassed her. The station master shifted his weight. "There's a morning train east, day after tomorrow. If you have the funds—" "I don't," she said, not sharply, just plainly. She had $17. She had done the arithmetic. It was not enough to get her back to Ohio, and there was nothing in Ohio to go back to. The station master didn't have an answer for that. He put his hat back on, which she understood meant the conversation was concluding. Eliza picked up her trunk and carried it to the bench and sat down on it. She laced her fingers together in her lap and stared at the planks of the platform floor and tried to think. This was when she became aware of being watched. Not in an aggressive way, more like the way you notice a particular kind of stillness, someone who is paying attention rather than pretending not to. She looked up. A man was standing at the far end of the platform near the lantern, and he was not pretending to look elsewhere. He was watching her directly, which should have felt intrusive and instead felt, she couldn't explain it, oddly decent. Like he wasn't trying to be subtle about the fact that he'd heard, that he was aware, that he wasn't going to make believe the situation didn't exist. He was older than Warren had described himself. Late 30s, she guessed. Thick through the shoulders, with a day's worth of dark stubble and a coat that had seen serious use. He had a hat in his hands. He'd taken it off, she realized, at some point during the station master's announcement. She hadn't noticed him do it, but he'd done it. He walked toward her. Not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate, like a man who'd decided something and was following through on it. "You're Warren's intended," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was," Eliza said, and her own voice surprised her. It came out steadier than she felt. "I knew him. Not well. Cattle business, mostly." He paused. "I'm sorry about what happened to him. He didn't deserve it." "Did you know him well enough to know that?" The question came out sharper than she intended. She wasn't sure why she'd asked it. He looked at her for a moment. Not offended, she thought, but recalibrating slightly. "Well enough," he said. He told her his name was Rhett Calder, that he ranched about 4 miles from town, along Iron Creek, that he had a widowed sister named Mara, who ran the only real boarding house in Briar Hollow, and that if Eliza needed somewhere to sleep tonight, somewhere safe, with a door that locked, he could take her there. "Why?" Eliza said. "Because it's cold, and the station bench isn't a bed," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "I guess it isn't." He was quiet for a second. "Because Warren wasn't a bad man and this isn't a fair situation, and because my sister would take you in whether I asked her to or not, so I might as well ask." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. She was exhausted and frightened in a deep, quiet way that she hadn't fully acknowledged to herself yet, and she had $17, and she did not know a single person in this town. "All right," she said. She stood, and before she could reach for her trunk, he'd already picked it up. Not in a proprietary way, just the automatic way of someone who'd decided to help and was actually doing it rather than waiting to be thanked. She followed him off the platform. That was the first time she trusted Rhett Calder. She didn't know yet how much that would matter. Mara Hale was nothing like her brother to look at. She was small and sharp-featured and moved with the efficiency of someone who had been managing things without help for a long time. She opened the boarding house door, took one look at Eliza, and pulled her inside without asking many questions. She put hot food in front of her. She showed her to a room on the second floor with a proper bolt on the door. She told her to sleep and that the morning's problems would still be there in the morning and didn't need settling tonight. Eliza sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark after Mara left and finally allowed herself to feel the shape of what had happened. She had traveled over 2,000 miles for a life that no longer existed. She had no job, no family, No fiancé, no plan. The plan she was good at making required some kind of material to work with, or money, position, options. She had none of those things. What she had was a battered trunk, a teaching certificate that meant nothing in Colorado, and the ability to do sums and keep records cleanly, which were skills people didn't often think to value until they'd gone without them long enough. She did not cry. She wasn't sure if that made her strong or simply numb. She lay down in her dress and pulled the blanket up and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally came for her, slow and reluctant, like something that didn't entirely trust her either. In the morning, Rhett came to the boarding house for breakfast, which was apparently a regular habit of his, and when Eliza came downstairs, Mara set a plate in front of her without asking, and Rhett moved over to give her room at the table. "You slept," he said. Not a question, an observation. "Some," she said. Mara poured coffee. Eliza wrapped her hands around the cup. "I need work," Eliza said, because she was not a woman who circled around things when she was tired. "I need it quickly, and I'm not too particular about what it is. I can teach, I can keep books, I can run a kitchen if necessary. I want to be straightforward with you about what I'm asking. I need wages and a room while I figure out what comes next." Mara opened her mouth. Rhett spoke first. "I have a proposition," he said, and then he stopped and seemed to be measuring how to say the next part. "Iron Creek has needed someone to manage the house and the accounts for about 2 years. My previous, the woman who did it, got married and moved to Denver. I've been doing the books myself, and I'm not, honestly, good at them. They're a disaster. I'd need someone willing to sort out a mess." "How much of a mess?" Eliza said. "The kind that's going to take weeks," he said. "And the terms? Wages, private room, no obligation beyond the work. You leave when you want." Eliza set down her coffee cup. She looked at this man who had picked up her trunk last night without making a ceremony of it, who had taken off his hat when he heard bad news about a woman he'd never met, who was now sitting across from her offering her a way out of a corner she had absolutely not managed to put herself into on her own. She wanted to trust him. That was what worried her. She had never been particularly naive, but she was desperate, and she knew desperate made people trust things they shouldn't. "You understand what people will say," she said, "an unmarried woman working at a bachelor's ranch." "I understand it," he said. "It's your name at risk more than mine. I won't pretend otherwise." "That's honest," she said. "I try," he said. She thought about the train east, the $17, the nothing waiting. "I'll need to see the books first," she said, "before I agree." He almost smiled. She wasn't sure because it came and went quickly. "Fair enough," he said. The books were, in fact, a disaster. Not because Rhett was careless, she could see he wasn't, exactly, but because he was a man who understood cattle and land and water and had no patience for the particular kind of attention that accounting required. Numbers blurred for him. He said so without embarrassment, which she appreciated. She sat at his desk in the ranch office and went through 3 years of ledgers while he stood in the doorway for a while, and then apparently realized she worked better without being watched and went outside. Within 2 hours, she had found 6 unpaid invoices, 2 double entries, and a running total that was off by enough money to matter. She also found something else, buried in a set of papers relating to water access agreements, documents that Rhett had signed and apparently filed without reading too closely. There were references to boundary markers along Iron Creek that didn't match the descriptions in the original deed she'd found in the bottom drawer. She didn't say anything about it yet. She wasn't sure what she was looking at, but she set those papers aside separately. When Rhett came back in at midday, she told him she'd take the job. "The invoices alone should recover enough to cover my wages for the first 3 months," she said. "And you have a discrepancy in your water agreement papers that I want to look at more carefully before I say anything definitive." He stood in the doorway looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Not suspicion. Something more like a man readjusting an expectation he hadn't known he was carrying. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. That was how Eliza Whitmore came to stay at Iron Creek Ranch on a Thursday morning in October, with no plan beyond the week in front of her and no idea yet of exactly what she had walked into the middle of. She had come west for a husband. Instead, she had found a ledger full of other people's dishonesty and a rancher who took his hat off for strangers. It was not the life she had planned, but she had always been better at adapting to what was in front of her than mourning what wasn't. So she rolled up her sleeves, both literally and in every other sense, and she got to work. Oh, the town of Briar Hollow had its own opinion about this arrangement, of course. Small towns always did. By the end of the first week, Eliza had noticed the way conversations adjusted when she walked into the general store. That particular kind of pause that told her she had been the subject of the sentence that just ended. She noticed the way Mrs. Harlan at the dry goods counter smiled too carefully. She noticed the two women by the post office who watched her pass with the focused attention of people who had already reached a verdict. She bought her flour and her thread and her notepaper and walked back to the wagon without giving them the satisfaction of appearing to notice. Rhett heard about the talk. She was sure of it. Ranch hands heard everything eventually, but he didn't mention it to her, and she didn't mention it to him, and they maintained a professional distance that was, she thought, about as conspicuous as the alternative would have been in a town this size. What actually occupied her attention was the water papers. She had gone back to them on her third day, and then again on her fifth, and by the end of her first week she had pulled together enough documents, from Rhett's files, from the records at the county assessor's that he'd had on hand for his own filings, from a set of letters tucked in the bottom of Warren Pike's surviving business papers, which Rhett had in his possession as a courtesy after Warren's death, to see a shape forming. Someone had been rewriting boundary descriptions, not in any document that would immediately look wrong on its own. But when you put 5 documents side by side and looked at where the language shifted, where a creek bend was described as north-facing in one paper and east-facing in another, where a marker stake was listed as being 12 yards from the cottonwood in one agreement and 20 in another, the cumulative effect was a slow, quiet remapping, and every variation nudged the effective claim on the creek water in the same direction, toward one man. She knew his name by the end of her second week, though she'd heard it before. Everyone in the valley said it with a particular quality, like they were being careful of the weight of it. Silas Vane. She didn't bring it to Rhett immediately. She needed to be sure. She needed to be the kind of sure that stood up to being argued with, because she was an unmarried Eastern woman on a ranch she'd worked at for 2 weeks, and anything she said that inconvenienced a powerful man would be dismissed as ignorance or hysteria, or both before the sentence was finished. So she was methodical. She was careful. She cross-referenced everything. And when she finally laid it out for Rhett, on a Saturday evening, with the paper spread across the desk and her notes written out in her clear, precise hand, she watched his face go through 3 or 4 different expressions, none of which he seemed to realize were visible. First, he looked like he was going to tell her she'd made a mistake. Then he looked at the papers. Then he was quiet for a long time. "This is Silas," he said finally. "I believe so," she said. "I can't prove it with only these documents, but the pattern—" "I see the pattern," he said. He sat down in the chair behind the desk, which was the first time she had seen him take that chair. He usually sat in the one across from it, ceding the desk to her work without making a point of it. He put his elbows on the desk and pressed his hands over his face for a moment. "Warren fought with Silas over the creek," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "You think that's why—" "I don't know," she said. "But I think it's possible. And I think if you have a lawyer look at these documents, a good one, before Silas has time to know they've been reviewed, he'll know," Rhett said. "This valley doesn't keep secrets." "Then we need to be faster than the secret," she said. He looked at her for a moment, long enough that she felt it. "We," he said. She hadn't meant to say it that way. Or maybe she had. She wasn't entirely sure. "I mean you," she said. "Your land. Your problem to handle." "No," he said slowly. "You said we, and you were right to." He picked up one of the documents, the one with the most obvious discrepancy, the one that had first made her certain. He looked at it, then set it back down. I wouldn't have found this. I'd have signed whatever I was given and thought I was keeping up with the paperwork." He met her eyes. "This was you, Eliza. Don't take that back." Nobody had said her name quite like that before, with that kind of straightforward weight, like it meant something specific. She straightened the papers unnecessarily. "We'll need to be careful," she said. "Yes," he said. Outside, the Colorado night had turned cold the way it did fast in October, dropping 10 degrees between sunset and full dark. The ranch was quiet. The hands had gone to the bunkhouse. They were alone in a lamplit office with evidence of serious wrongdoing spread between them, and for just a moment, just one, Eliza allowed herself to notice that she was not afraid. Not of the work, not of Silas Vane, not of this man sitting across from her who had taken off his hat on an empty platform for a stranger with nowhere to go. She had come to Briar Hollow with nothing and landed in the middle of something that was going to require every skill she had. It was not what she had planned, but she was beginning to think, quietly, cautiously, the way she thought about things she wasn't ready to trust yet, that it might be what she was made for. The first frost came early that year. Eliza noticed it on a Monday morning when she stepped outside before dawn to fetch water from the pump and found the ground stiff beneath her boots, the grass blades white and brittle at the edges. She stood there for a moment with the empty bucket in her hand and watched the sky go from black to deep blue to the particular shade of gray-pink that came just before the sun crested the mountains. It was the kind of morning that would have been beautiful if she'd had time to stand still and appreciate it. She didn't. She filled the bucket and went back inside. She had been at Iron Creek for 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, she had reorganized the entire ledger system, recovered $412 in unpaid invoices that Rhett hadn't known to follow up on, established a written record-keeping process for the ranch hands' hours that replaced the previous system, which had apparently been Rhett's memory and a few chalk marks on the barn wall, and begun a kitchen garden in the narrow strip of sun on the south side of the ranch house, even though everyone told her it was too late in the season to start one. "You'll get maybe 2 weeks out of it before the ground freezes," said Tom Greer, the oldest of Rhett's ranch hands, a weathered man of about 60 who had initially watched her with the wariness of someone who'd seen hired help come and go and knew the type that caused problems. 2 weeks of greens is better than none," Eliza said. Tom Greer watched her plant turnips for a moment and then, without comment, picked up a second spade and started on the far end of the row. That was how most of it went. She didn't argue. She didn't explain herself at length. She just did the thing, and people either got out of her way or they joined her, and either way the thing got done. The ranch hands had taken her measure quickly, the way working people do. Not by what someone says about themselves, but by whether they show up on time and do what they said they'd do. Eliza showed up. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She learned their names and used them, learned who had a bad knee that slowed him down in cold weather and who couldn't read the supply list she posted on the board by the barn. So she started reading them aloud in the mornings without drawing attention to the reason. By the end of the second week, 3 of the 6 hands would tip their hats to her in the morning without being prompted, which Mara told her, when Eliza mentioned it in passing, was practically a standing ovation from that particular group of men. But what occupied her mind more than the garden or the accounts or the cautious social mathematics of being an unmarried woman on a working ranch was the water papers. She had pulled them out twice more since the evening she'd laid them in front of Rhett. Not because she'd missed anything, but because she needed to be the kind of certain that didn't waver under pressure. She had added 3 new documents to her analysis: a county survey filed 4 years ago, a water use agreement between 2 neighboring ranchers that referenced Iron Creek and its margins, and most usefully, a handwritten note she'd found tucked inside Warren Pike's business correspondence that referenced a meeting with a land agent named Croft. She didn't know who Croft was yet, but the name appeared twice in Silas Vane's related correspondence, which Rhett had come across in his own files in the months after Warren's death. That wasn't nothing. That was a thread. Rhett had sent a letter to a lawyer in Denver. He hadn't told her he was going to do it. He mentioned it at supper one evening the same way he mentioned the water pump needed a new washer, matter-of-factly, without ceremony, as if it were simply the next logical step. She'd looked up from her plate, and he'd met her eyes, and that was the whole conversation. She appreciated that about him. He didn't explain his decisions to her or seek her approval, but he acted on what she gave him, which was more than she'd expected from a man who'd never had reason before to take a woman's professional judgment seriously. She was trying very hard not to think too carefully about what else she appreciated about him. That was a door she wasn't ready to open. The first time she heard Silas Vane's name said in her direct presence rather than around her, she was at the general store on a Wednesday afternoon buying lamp oil and a length of heavy thread. She was at the counter when the bell over the door sounded behind her, and she heard the particular shift in the room, the way 3 separate conversations quieted by half a degree simultaneously, that told her someone significant had walked in. She didn't turn immediately. She counted her coins and listened. Harlan? A voice. Unhurried. The kind of voice that had never once in its life needed to raise itself to be heard. You get my order in? Yes, sir, Mr. Vane. Came in on Tuesday's wagon. Eliza kept her eyes on the counter. She finished paying, picked up her package, and turned. Silas Vane was taller than she'd pictured him, which she supposed was stupid. She'd built a picture of him from documents, and documents didn't convey height. He was perhaps 50, silver-haired, broad through the chest, with the particular kind of physical confidence that came not from fitness, but from decades of other people getting out of his way. He was dressed well. Better than the climate required, she thought. His coat was fine wool, his boots were recent. He wore money like a second skin, the way men did when they'd had it long enough to stop noticing it. He noticed her. Not immediately. He was directing some question to Harlan about his order, but then his eyes moved across the room the way powerful men's eyes moved, cataloging, assessing, categorizing, and landed on her. She looked back. She didn't look away first. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't calculated bravery. It was just that looking away felt like the wrong thing to do, and she'd learned over the past month that her instincts on that kind of thing were usually sound. Silas Vane's eyes registered something. She couldn't name it precisely. A recalibration, maybe. Like a man who'd picked up an object expecting a certain weight and found it different. You're the woman staying at Calder's ranch, he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a statement, delivered the way he'd probably delivered every statement in his life, as if it were simply obvious. I work at Iron Creek, yes, she said. I heard you were Warren Pike's intended. I was. Shame about Warren. He said it the same way a man said it was a shame it was raining. Convenient words. Nothing underneath them. You planning to stay on in the valley? I haven't made any decisions beyond the month, she said. He studied her for another moment. She had the distinct sensation of being weighed. Not the way men sometimes looked at women. This wasn't that. This was assessment. The kind a man did when he was trying to determine whether something was a problem. She kept her face pleasant and empty. Well, he said, and turned back to Harlan. See that Calder gets my regards. He said it to Harlan, but it was meant for her. She knew that. She picked up her oil and thread and walked to the door and out into the cold air, and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, breathing steadily. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the effort of standing in a room with a man she was increasingly certain had blood on his hands and keeping her face quiet. She walked back to the wagon, set her purchases in the back, and climbed up to the seat. She had just been looked at by Silas Vane and dismissed as a minor inconvenience. That was, she thought, probably the single most useful thing that could have happened. Men who dismissed you stopped watching you. She told Rhett about the encounter that evening, clinically, without embellishment. He listened with his forearms on the table, turning his coffee cup in a slow circle the way he did when he was thinking. He knows you're here, he said. He's known I was here, she said. The whole town has known I was here. Knowing you work for me is different from having seen your face and made a judgment about it. What judgment do you think he made? Rhett was quiet for a moment. He decided you're not a problem, he said, which means as long as he believes that, we have room to work. That's what I thought. He looked at her across the table. You're not going to tell me you were frightened. I was, she said. A little. That doesn't change what I just said. Something shifted in his face. She'd noticed it happen sometimes, moments where his expression moved and then settled back like he'd thought something he hadn't decided whether to say. You should have been more than a little frightened, he said. He's a dangerous man. I know that, she said, but being frightened doesn't help the situation, so I try to use it up quickly and move on to what's useful. He looked at her for a beat longer than he needed to and then looked at his coffee. That's a sensible way to be, he said. I've had some practice, she said. The letter from Denver arrived on a Friday, and it was not, precisely, good news. The lawyer, a man named Aldous Trent, who'd been recommended by a rancher Rhett trusted, wrote that the boundary discrepancies Rhett had described were, on their own, insufficient grounds for legal challenge. Water rights law in Colorado in 1876 was a relatively unsettled area, he wrote, and boundary language in informal agreements was frequently imprecise by nature. without direct evidence of deliberate falsification, forged signatures, documented instructions from a party to change language, a witness to the alteration. The pattern Eliza had identified was persuasive but not actionable. Rhett read the letter twice and put it on the desk without saying anything. Eliza had already read it. He'd handed it to her first, without comment, which she was still adjusting to. She said nothing for a moment either. "He's not wrong," she said finally. "I know." "We need Croft," she said. "We don't know who Croft is. We know he's a land agent. We know his name appears in Warren's papers in connection with a meeting that happened 6 months before Warren died. And we know his name appears in Silas Vane's records." "Appearing in someone's records isn't evidence of anything." "No," she said. "But it's a place to start." She tapped her finger on the desk. Silas needed someone to physically alter the language in those documents. He didn't do it himself. Men like him never do anything themselves. Croft is a land agent. Land agents handle documents, handle boundary descriptions, handle the language of agreements. Rhett was quiet, looking at the ceiling. "If Croft altered those documents," she continued, "he's either still working for Silas or he's moved on, and Silas has no use for him anymore. Either way, he's not Silas Vane. He doesn't have Silas's resources. He doesn't have Silas's protection." She let that sit. People in precarious positions sometimes prefer insurance to loyalty. Rhett looked at her. "You want to find Croft?" he said. "I want to find out where he is," she said. "What happens after that depends on what kind of man he turns out to be." "Eliza." He said her name with a kind of weight in it that made her stop. "If Vane finds out we're looking for Croft, I know." He had Warren killed over a water claim, a man with legal documentation and years in this valley. "I know," she said, and she meant it. She wasn't dismissing the danger. She was measuring it against the alternative, which was Silas Vane tightening his grip on this valley inch by quiet inch until there was nothing left to fight for. Rhett pressed his mouth together. He looked like a man who was arguing with himself and not winning. "I'll ask around," he said finally, carefully. "Men I trust. About a land agent named Croft who worked in the valley maybe 2-3 years ago." "Carefully," she agreed. November came with its own agenda. The days shortened fast, and the temperature dropped by degrees every week, and the ranch shifted into winter preparation mode. The kind of sustained, unglamorous work that kept you too busy and too tired to think about much beyond the next task. Hay was stacked. Fences were checked and mended. The cattle were moved from the high pastures to the lower ones where the snow wouldn't trap them. A 3-day job that took all the hands, and Rhett came back filthy and worn down to the bone. Eliza spent those 3 days reorganizing the cellar and the root supply and putting up the last of the fall preserves and having an argument with Tom Greer about whether it was worth patching the east wall of the bunkhouse before the real cold set in, or whether they should wait until spring. "Waiting means those men freeze every night for 4 months," she said. "It means we don't waste lumber on a repair that'll need redoing in spring anyway," Tom said. "Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. Patch it now with what you have on hand. Do it properly in the spring." Tom gave her the look of a man who was not accustomed to being out-argued and did not entirely enjoy the experience. Then he patched the east wall. She was up on the second night of the men's absence when she heard hoofbeats outside, and for a moment her stomach tightened in a particular way. But it was only Mara, arriving unannounced on horseback at 9 in the evening, her hair half down from its pins, and her expression carrying news. "I heard something," Mara said, once she was inside and had her hands around a cup of something hot. "At the boarding house. Man came through 2 days ago, staying one night on his way through to Denver. Didn't give a name, but he had papers on him. I didn't read them. I'm not that kind of person, but I happened to see the name on the top sheet when he set them on the table to eat." Eliza waited. "Croft," Mara said. The silence between them was short and specific. "He's on his way to Denver," Eliza said. "He was 2 days ago. Whether he stopped anywhere between here and there, did he say anything to anyone?" "He talked to himself more than to other people. Muttered, mostly." Mara wrapped her hands tighter around the cup. "One thing he said clearly enough that Dory in the kitchen heard it. Said he was done and that he wasn't, those were her words, that he wasn't going to be the only one holding the rope." Eliza's breath went very still. Holding the rope. That was a man with something on his conscience, or a man who had recently realized that being useful to someone like Silas Vane ended when your usefulness did, and that the ending might not be on terms he chose. Did Dory see what the papers were? Eliza asked. She's not educated, Mara said. She knows her numbers, but reading's slow for her. She said there were names and numbers and something that looked like a map. Boundary documents. It had to be. He's running, Eliza said. That was my thought, Mara said. Eliza stood up, sat down, stood up again. She'd never been someone who paced, and she was pacing now, which told her something about the state of her mind. If Silas finds out Croft is moving, if Croft has documents that prove what was done to those water agreements, then those documents are either about to disappear or be used as protection, Mara said. She was watching her sister-in-law with careful eyes. Eliza, you can't go to Denver. I know that, and Rhett's in the high field until day after tomorrow. I know that too. So what are you going to do? Eliza stopped pacing. She looked at Mara, who was a small, practical woman who had been widowed at 31 and had raised 2 children and built a business without asking anyone for permission, and who was currently looking at her with an expression that was partly concern and partly something that looked, around the edges, like respect. I'm going to write a letter, Eliza said, to Aldous Trent in Denver, tonight, and I need someone reliable to write it to the Morning Post. I can do that, Mara said. The letter is going to ask him to find a land agent named Croft, who is either in transit to Denver or recently arrived there. It's going to tell him that this man may be carrying documents that are material to a legal matter, and that if he's willing to speak with counsel, he should be heard before someone else finds him first. You think Vane's people are already looking for him? If Croft is running, it means Silas knows he's running. Yes. I think the window is days, maybe less. Mara set down her cup. She stood up without drama. Write the letter, she said. I'll be at the post office when it opens. The men came back from the high field on Thursday evening, tired and mud-stained and smelling of horse and cold sweat. Rhett walked into the ranch house and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Eliza with the automatic awareness of a man who read rooms quickly. What happened? He said. Not a question. She told him. All of it. Mara's visit, Croft, the letter to Trent. She didn't soften any of it or arrange it in a more palatable order. She just said what had happened and what she'd done and why. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You should have waited for me, he said. There wasn't time. Eliza. Rhett. She said his name the same way he said hers, with weight. If I had waited 2 days, Croft would have been in Denver before Trent even knew to look. Whatever he's carrying, whatever he knows, might have been buried or destroyed or used to bargain with someone we don't want him bargaining with. I made a judgment. He ran a hand over his face. He was still in his coat, still dirty from the field, and he looked exhausted, and she could see him pushing through the exhaustion to think clearly. You're right, he said. And then, immediately, as if it cost him something. You're right. You made the right call. It surprised her. Not because she hadn't thought she was right, but because in her experience, most men with any authority at all took a few days to come around to admitting that, and he'd done it in the same breath as the objection. She didn't say anything for a moment. I'm going to need you to understand something, he said. He was looking at her directly, the way he did. No sideways approach, no polite circumvention. If Silas finds out that we've been looking into this, really looking, not just a woman reorganizing ledgers, but actually pursuing evidence, this becomes a different situation. I know that. I'm not sure you... I know what happened to Warren, she said quietly. I'm not forgetting that. He stopped. The kitchen was warm. She'd kept the stove going. And the rest of the ranch was settling into the sounds of evening, men heading to the bunkhouse, the stamp and shift of horses in the barn. It was a moment that felt complete somehow, contained, like a room within a room. We should hear from Trent within 2 weeks, she said, bringing them back. Rhett nodded. He started to turn toward the hallway and then stopped. You put a patch on the bunkhouse east wall, he said. She'd wondered when he'd notice. Tom and I decided it needed doing. Tom Greer decided something needed doing before spring? He came around, she said. Rhett looked at her a second longer than he had to. I'll bet he did, he said, and went down the hall. Eliza stayed in the kitchen and stirred the pot on the stove and listened to the sound of the house settling into evening around her and did not think about the way he'd said "you're right," just that directly, without qualification, and failed entirely. The town of Briar Hollow made its next move on a Saturday. Not a dramatic move, not the kind of thing you could point to and say this was the moment. It was a series of small incidents that accumulated the way water wore its stone, barely perceptible on any given day, significant in total. She went to the dry goods store, and Mrs. Harlan was suddenly uncertain whether she could extend credit to ranch accounts managed by someone other than the ranch's owner. She went to the church social that Mara had persuaded her to attend and found herself seated, without obvious intent but with unmistakable effect, at the periphery of every grouping rather than within them. She overheard, with her back turned but her ears working perfectly, a woman named Clara Pruitt say to another woman that it was a peculiar situation, an Eastern woman so established in a bachelor rancher's household, and that some people had more proprietary instincts than was becoming. Proprietary instincts. Eliza counted to 5, slowly, in her head. She turned around. Clara Pruitt was perhaps 40, wife of one of the more prosperous shopkeepers, and she wore the expression of a woman who had not quite realized she'd been overheard and was now deciding whether to brazen it out. Eliza said, very pleasantly, "I keep the books, Mrs. Pruitt, and manage the household accounts and teach arithmetic to 7 children whose parents can't afford a schoolhouse tutor. I find it keeps my proprietary instincts quite fully occupied." Clara Pruitt said nothing. The other woman, younger, whose name Eliza didn't know, made a sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Eliza went back to the supper table and ate her apple cake and conversed with Mara, and did not look at Clara Pruitt again. On the walk out, the younger woman fell into step beside her. "I'm Frances Aldred," she said. "My husband has the North Quarter section past the Denny farm." "Eliza Whitmore," Eliza said. "I know who you are." Frances said it without any weight to it, just fact. "My oldest boy, Tom, he's 8. He's one of the ones you've been teaching. He came home last week and showed me his sums. He did 17 of them, and they were all right." Eliza looked at her. "He couldn't do his sums before," Frances said. "I want you to know that." It was such a simple thing to say. Eliza was not prepared for it and didn't have time to manage her reaction, which meant something moved in her face before she could stop it, something that was not entirely composed. "He's a quick learner," she said. "He just needed someone to slow down for him at the beginning." "That's all some people need," Frances Aldred said. Then she nodded, the way a sensible woman nodded when she'd said what she came to say, and walked back toward her husband, who was waiting by the wagon. Well, 3 things happened in the last week of November, and they happened in quick enough succession that Eliza later thought of them not as separate events, but as a single turn of a wheel. The first was that Tom Greer came to her on a Monday morning and told her quietly, out of earshot of the other hands, that a man had been asking questions at the feed store, asking about Iron Creek, about the water agreements, about who was managing the business interests of the ranch. "Did you get a name?" Eliza asked. "No," Tom said. "But Pete over at the feed store said he was well-dressed, city-dressed, didn't know cattle. Not a rancher, an intermediary. Someone Silas used for errands he didn't want attached to his own name." "Don't tell Rhett I told you," Tom said. She looked at him. Tom Greer, who had watched her with wariness for 3 weeks and then picked up a second spade without saying why. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. He considered it for a moment. "Because you're the one who'd know what to do with it," he said, and walked back to the barn. The second thing was a letter from Aldous Trent, arriving midweek. He had found Croft. Or rather, Croft had been findable in the way that frightened men sometimes were, stationary, holed up in a rooming house near the rail yard, unwilling to move until he knew which direction was safe. Trent had sent a clerk to make initial contact, and the clerk had come back with a message that Croft would speak to a lawyer. Not write it down. Speak. Trent's letter to Rhett said he needed someone to come to Denver who had direct knowledge of the documents in question and could recognize specific language if Croft referenced it. Rhett read the letter and looked up. "I need to go to Denver," he said. "I know," Eliza said. "I'll be 4 days, maybe 5? She nodded. He looked at her with an expression she had begun to be able to read, slightly, around the edges. Not the words under the words, more the tone, the register. "You'll be all right," he said. "I'll be fine," she said. The accounts don't run themselves while you're gone. He made a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd been a different kind of man. No, he said. I suppose they don't. He left the following morning, early, before the sun was fully up. She was in the kitchen when he came through. He stopped in the doorway. He was doing that a lot lately, stopping in doorways, as if he made his decisions at thresholds. There's a shotgun in the hall closet, he said. Top shelf. It's loaded. You know how to use one? My father taught me, she said. Before your mother or sister tells you I can't manage. I haven't suggested you can't manage, he said. I'm telling you where the shotgun is. She looked at him. He was wearing his traveling coat and his good hat, and he had a bag over his shoulder, and in the gray early light, he looked very specifically like a man who was about to be somewhere else. And she was aware, with a clarity she hadn't been expecting, that she was going to miss his presence in the house. She did not say that. Travel carefully, she said. I'll be back in 5 days, he said. And then he left. The third thing happened on the second day of his absence. Silas Vane came to Iron Creek Ranch himself. She was at the desk in the office when she heard horses in the yard. Not one horse, two. And something in the rhythm of the approach made her put down her pen. She went to the window. Silas Vane was dismounting with the easy authority of a man who arrived where he wanted, when he wanted, and expected to be received. She had maybe 30 seconds to decide how to handle this. She went to the hall closet. She did not take down the shotgun. She stood in front of the closed door for one breath, then turned and walked to the front door and opened it before he had the chance to knock. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them pretended surprise. Mr. Vane, she said, Rhett Calder isn't at the ranch. Is there something I can help you with? When's he back? I'm not certain, she said. Business in Denver. Something moved behind Silas Vane's eyes. Quick, almost invisible. She filed it. I'll come back, he said. I'll let him know you stopped by. He looked at her. The same assessing look as in the store, but different now. He'd dismissed her then. He wasn't entirely doing that now. You've been going through Warren's business papers, he said. It was not a question, and it was not casual. As part of managing Iron Creek's records, I've reviewed various documents related to the property and water agreements, she said. Her voice was steady. It was steady because she was making it steady with deliberate effort, the same way she'd made it steady on the platform the night she arrived. Is there something specific you're concerned about, Mr. Vane? He looked at her for a long moment. Just making conversation, he said. Of course, she said. He touched the brim of his hat, not warmly, just as punctuation, and turned back to his horse. She watched him mount and ride out of the yard with his man following, and she stood in the doorway until they were well past the gate and on the road. Then she went back inside, sat down at the desk, picked up her pen, and found that her hand was shaking enough that the ink came out wrong on the first word. She set the pen down. She pressed both hands flat on the desktop and breathed for a moment. Silas Vane had come to the ranch while Rhett was gone. He had referenced Warren's papers. He had looked at her the second time with something more specific than dismissal. He was reconsidering what she was. She had perhaps days, fewer possibly, before he finished reconsidering. She picked up the pen again, held it until the shaking stopped, and went back to work, because the accounts didn't wait, and neither did she. Rhett came back from Denver on the 5th day, as promised, arriving in the late afternoon with mud on his boots and something different in the set of his jaw. A particular kind of tight that she had learned to read as contained information. He came through the front door, set his bag down in the hallway, and walked directly to the office where she was working. She looked up. He sat down in the chair across from the desk, the one he always chose, the one that left her the desk, and put his hat on his knee and looked at her with that direct, uncluttered attention that she had stopped trying to interpret neutrally. Croft talked, he said. She set her pen down. How much? Enough. He let that sit for a moment. He altered 9 documents over a period of 3 years. Boundary descriptions, water flow measurements, marker positions. All of it shifted the effective claim on Iron Creek's water south and west, toward Vane's primary grazing land. He said Vane told him it was a correction of historical surveying errors. And he believed that. He said he believed it the first time. By the third time he believed it because Vane was paying him very well to believe it. Rhett's voice was flat. Not angry in any explosive way, just the flatness of a man who had heard something that confirmed what he'd suspected and found it unsatisfying to be right. He kept copies. The room went quiet in a specific way. He kept copies, Eliza said, of 4 of the 9. Trent says 4 is enough. He says he has enough now to petition the county court for a review of the water agreements, all the ones in the valley, not just ours. He says with Croft willing to testify, which he is because he's decided that being the man who came forward is safer long-term than being Silas Vane's liability. He's right about that, Eliza said quietly. Trent agrees. Rhett turned his hat over in his hands. He says it won't be fast. Legal proceedings in this territory move slow, months, maybe into next year, and Vane will have his own lawyers. But it starts. It starts. He looked at her. Trent also said, and he said this clearly, not as a compliment but as a legal observation, that the case couldn't have been built without the documentary analysis done here at the ranch, without someone who knew what they were looking at and why the inconsistencies mattered. Eliza said nothing for a moment. She looked at the desk, at the papers arranged in their careful stacks, at the evidence of weeks of meticulous attention that had begun as bookkeeping and turned into something considerably more serious. Silas Vane came here while you were gone, she said. Rhett went still. She told him all of it. The horses in the yard, the doorway, the 30 seconds of decision, the steady voice, the question about Warren's papers. His eyes, through the whole of it, did something she recognized as controlled anger, the kind that didn't look like anger from the outside, because a man who'd learned to manage it kept it just below the surface. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He referenced the papers specifically, he said. Yes. That means someone told him we'd been reviewing them. Or he assumed it when you went to Denver and he found out. How would he find out I went to Denver? Because this is Briar Hollow, she said, and everyone knows everything, and someone at the livery or the post or the feed store mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone who works for Silas Vane, because that's how small towns work, and men like him pay for exactly that kind of information. He pressed his mouth together. He knew she was right. What did you do after he left? I finished the accounts, she said. He looked at her. What else was I going to do, she said. He stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the yard where the early dark was gathering. She could see the line of his shoulders, and she had learned in these weeks what the particular set of them meant, the extra fraction of tension that signaled he was carrying something he hadn't decided how to say yet. He's going to come back, Rhett said, when he's decided what you are. I know. And what we do between now and then matters a great deal. I know that too. He turned from the window. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, or rather, one she'd seen the edges of and looked away from before she could identify it fully. He stood in the lamplight of the office, surrounded by her organized papers and his disorganized history. And he said, I didn't like being 4 days right away while you were here alone with that man riding into the yard. The sentence landed between them, and neither of them moved for a moment. I handled it, she said. Her voice came out carefully level. I know you did, he said. That's not what I'm saying. She understood what he was saying. She was choosing, very deliberately, not to respond to what he was saying. Not yet. Not in the middle of all of this. We should write to Trent about a timeline, she said. He held her eyes for one beat longer. Then he nodded, once, and said, I'll draft something in the morning, and went down the hall. Eliza sat at the desk for a moment after he left. She looked at the lamp. She breathed. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. December arrived like a door closing. Not gradually. Colorado didn't do gradual in winter. It did sudden, decisive, deeply committed cold that settled over the valley in the first week of the month and announced itself as permanent until it chose otherwise. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. The creek developed ice at its edges. The ranch hands started wearing their heaviest coats before sunrise and kept them on until after dark. Eliza moved the morning arithmetic lessons for the children from the barn, where she'd been holding them because it was the largest covered space, to the ranch house kitchen, which was warmer and meant she had to bake something every session or freeze, which suited her well enough. 7 children ranging in age from 6 to 13 crowded around the kitchen table twice a week, while she taught them sums and fractions, and when the lesson went long and the mood was right, read to them from whatever book she had on hand. Francis Aldred's boy Tom was, as his mother had said, quick. He sat at the corner of the table and worked faster than the others, and when he finished, he'd pick up his pencil and start drawing in the margins of his paper. Horses, mostly, but sometimes the mountains or the barn or once. In startling detail, Eliza's own hands as she wrote on the board. She'd noticed it and said nothing, which was the right call because he'd shown her the drawing afterward without being asked. "It's good," she said, and meant it. He shrugged with the particular studied indifference of an 8-year-old who had been told his drawing was good and wasn't sure whether to believe it. "My pa says drawing doesn't feed cattle." "No," she said, "but a man who can see things accurately and put them on paper has skills that go a long way in surveying and architecture and engineering and any number of things that feed quite a lot of cattle indirectly." He thought about this. "What's architecture?" "Come back next Tuesday and bring paper," she said. He came back. She taught the lesson she'd planned and then spent the last 20 minutes showing him how to measure a building's proportions and put them on paper to scale. He bent over the page with an intensity she recognized, the kind that lived in a person whether they were encouraged or not, just waiting for someone to hand it a direction. She didn't think about whether this was part of her job. It simply needed doing, and she was there. The letter that changed the winter arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of December, and it came not from Trent in Denver, but from the county assessor's office in a town called Hargrove, 40 miles south. Rhett read it first, which was unusual. He generally handed her correspondence that related to the accounts or water matters first, a habit they'd fallen into naturally. He read it, and his expression did something she'd never seen it do before, which was go carefully, deliberately blank in the way of a man controlling a reaction he didn't want witnessed. He handed it to her without a word. She read it. The county assessor had filed a formal notice of disputed water rights along Iron Creek, citing conflicting boundary descriptions in registered agreements. A review board would be convened in the spring. All parties with registered claims along the creek were to present their documentation, which would have been straightforward and almost welcome news. It was what Trent had said would happen, except for one additional item in the second paragraph. The disputed section, per the assessor's preliminary review, included not only Silas Vane's claims but also Iron Creek Ranch's registered water draw. The review would examine all claims simultaneously, which meant that until the board ruled, the ranch's legal right to its current water draw was in a state of official uncertainty. "He filed first," Eliza said. "He filed first," Rhett agreed. She looked up from the letter. "He found out about Croft. Or he anticipated it. Either way, he's not waiting for us to build a case. He's forcing the question now, in a forum he's had years to prepare for, with lawyers we can't match, and documentation we haven't had time to properly compile for presentation. Trent has 4 documents and a land agent who's scared enough to testify, but not necessarily stable enough to hold up under Vane's counsel's cross-examination." Rhett sat down. He looked like a man reassessing a hand he'd thought was stronger than it was. "If the board rules against us pending the review, if they restrict our water draw as a precautionary measure while the case is ongoing," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Without full water access through winter, the cattle couldn't be sustained. Without cattle, the ranch had no income. Without income, the legal fight couldn't be financed. It was a trap that looked like a legal proceeding. Eliza put the letter on the desk and stared at it. "He's done this before," she said, "to the smaller ranches. He didn't come after them all at once. He weakened them one at a time through exactly this kind of procedural maneuvering until they couldn't afford to fight." "I know." "Warren tried to fight it directly, and Silas—" She stopped. "Yes," Rhett said. She looked at him. "We need the other ranchers." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking, not resistant to the idea, but measuring it. "They're scared," he said. "Half of them have already had some version of this done to them. Asking them to stand up alongside us is asking them to stop being managed one at a time," she said. "He's picked them off individually for years because they let him, because it was easier to survive by staying small and quiet than to band together and make noise." She heard her own voice. She wasn't quite lecturing him, and she made a note to bring it down a register. "I'm sorry, you know them better than I do." "No," he said. "You're right." I was looking at her with that expression again, the one she'd stopped trying to look away from because it seemed dishonest to pretend it wasn't there. "You've been right about most of this." "Not all of it." "Most. He stood. I'll ride to the Aldred place and the Denny farm tomorrow, and I'll talk to Henderson over by the North Fork. He's had trouble with Vane for 2 years, and I think he's angrier than he is scared. He picked up his hat. It'll take time. How much time do we have before the preliminary hearing? Trent says 6 weeks. 6 weeks in December and January in Colorado. 6 weeks to convince frightened men and women to stop being afraid. 6 weeks with the temperature dropping and the valley tightening into itself, and Silas Vane very likely doing his own version of this same conversation, except that his version came with money and lawyers and the accumulated weight of a man nobody in Briar Hollow had ever successfully challenged. All right, Eliza said. You ride to the ranches. I'll write to Trent about the preliminary filing, and I'll go through every related document we have again and pull anything that speaks directly to established use. Continuous, documented, multi-year water use that predates Vane's claim boundaries. That's weeks of work. I know. I'll start tonight. He looked at her for a moment, that threshold hesitation she'd learned to recognize. Then, you eat first, he said. Whatever else is going on, you eat. It was such a simple thing, she wasn't entirely sure why it lodged somewhere behind her sternum the way it did. I always eat, she said. You skip lunch when you're deep in the records. She opened her mouth, closed it. He was not wrong about that. Fine, she said. He almost smiled. I'll tell Tom to put the horses up. What followed was the most exhausting 3 weeks of Eliza's life, which was saying something given the year that had preceded them. She worked the records in the morning and afternoon, breaking only to teach her twice-weekly lessons and to eat the meals that appeared on the kitchen table with a regularity that she eventually realized was Rhett's deliberate effort. He had quietly rearranged the household schedule so that supper was ready at 7, regardless of whether either of them had surfaced from their respective work. He didn't mention it. She didn't mention it. She ate, and she was grateful. And she was also aware that gratitude was not the only thing she felt, and was still very deliberately not opening that door. She found what she needed on a Thursday in the 3rd week. She'd been working through a box of documents that had come with the ranch when Rhett's father had deeded it to him. Papers from 15 years back, some older, many of which appeared to be simply historical records of no immediate use. She had been sorting them into categories with the methodical patience of someone who had learned that things filed badly were often more valuable than things never filed at all. The document was handwritten, faded, dated 21 years prior. It was a water usage record, an informal one, the kind that ranchers in the early days of the valley had kept among themselves before there was formal registration infrastructure. It listed in a neat, careful hand the names of every property drawing from Iron Creek and the established draw amounts and seasonal adjustments. 7 properties, all of them still existing in some form, all of them with documented draw rights that predated Silas Vane's purchase of his current holdings by 6 years. She read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and pressed her hand over her mouth and breathed through her nose for a moment because her hands were shaking and she did not want to damage the document. She found Rhett in the barn. She didn't say anything. She just held out the paper. He looked at her face first, then took the paper and read it, and she watched him go through the same process she had. The comprehension, the meaning of it, the implication. He looked up. This predates his holdings, he said. By 6 years, she said, every property on that list had established draw rights before Silas Vane owned a single acre in this valley. You can't manipulate boundary language to erase a prior claim that's documented in writing from before you arrived. He was quiet for a moment. Trent needs to see this immediately. I know. I need to make a careful copy tonight before anything happens to the original. Then we send the original to Denver with a courier, not the post. He was still looking at the paper. She could see something in him releasing slightly. Not relief exactly, more like the adjustment a person made when the ground under them became fractionally more solid. Eliza, he said. Don't, she said. He looked at her. Don't thank me, she said. It was in your own files. It was always in your own files. It just needed someone to go through the box. That's not what I was going to say, he said. She waited. He folded the paper carefully. He'd noticed her fold it along its existing creases. She registered. He'd paid enough attention to know how she handled old documents and handed it back to her. I was going to say that my father kept meticulous records, and I haven't appreciated that until right now. She let out a breath that was closer to a laugh than she'd expected. "Oh," she said. "Go make your copy," he said. But he was almost smiling again, and this time it lasted a half-second longer before it went away. The cold deepened the following week into something that had nothing casual about it. Rhett had been riding the neighboring ranches, and the conversations were going the way first conversations about frightening things always went, cautiously, with a lot of listening and not a lot of committing. Henderson at the North Fork had been the most receptive. He was a stocky, plain-spoken man who'd watched Vane chip away at his grazing access for 2 years and had the anger of someone who'd been waiting for a direction to aim it. The Aldrids were cautious but not hostile. The Denny family, who ran the property north of the Aldrids, had a complicated history with Vane that Rhett summarized as, he helped them out of a debt situation 4 years ago, and they've been trying to figure out what that actually cost them ever since. What did it actually cost them? Eliza asked. Their East Side water access. They signed something in the relief agreement they didn't read carefully, 2 pages from the end. She absorbed this. Did they know? By the time they knew, they'd needed his help with another bad winter, and they were in deeper. He paused. They're not bad people. I didn't suggest they were, she said. People in hard situations make the decisions available to them. That's not the same as being bad. He looked at her. No, he agreed. I suppose it isn't. The document copy went to Trent. Trent wrote back within 10 days, fast for Denver in December, with a tone that had shifted perceptibly from careful legal hedging to something closer to focused energy. He believed the prior claim document, combined with Croft's testimony and the boundary analysis, was sufficient to request a formal injunction against any restriction of Iron Creek Ranch's current water draw pending the review board's proceedings. He was filing immediately. Silas Vane's lawyers responded within the week. Their response questioned the document's authenticity, argued that the handwriting, the paper, and the informal nature of the record could not be reliably established as genuine, and further argued that even if genuine informal agreements between private parties did not constitute a legally registered claim under current territorial water law. Trent wrote back to Rhett with a note at the bottom of the legal summary that said simply, "They're worried. The objections are the kind you raise when you don't have a stronger argument." Eliza read that line 3 times and felt something that was almost warmth. Oh, Christmas came without ceremony. The ranch didn't stop for it the way she'd known it back east. There were animals to tend regardless of the calendar, and December was its own kind of relentless. But Mara came for Christmas dinner and brought 2 of her boarders who had nowhere else to be, and the kitchen was full in a way that Eliza suspected it hadn't been in some time. And Rhett came in from checking on the cattle at midday with cold in his coat and his hair, and stamped his boots at the door in a way that should have been ordinary and somehow wasn't. After the meal, when Mara had gone home and the boarders had retired to the sitting room, Eliza was washing up and Rhett was drying, which was an arrangement they'd fallen into without discussion, and it was quiet except for the stove and the wind outside and the distant sound of the ranch settling into winter evening. "You didn't go east for Christmas," he said. "There was nothing to go east to," she said. "There's the teaching certificate, the city. More options than a ranch in Rhett." She handed him a plate. "If I'd wanted to leave, I would have left." He dried the plate, put it on the stack. "I know." "Oh, then why are you bringing it up?" He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding something beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, which was the kind of observation she'd been carefully not making for 2 months. "Because I want to understand whether you're here because it's the best available option," he said, "or whether you're here because you want to be here." She stopped washing. She looked at the window over the sink, at the dark outside, at the reflection of the lamplit kitchen. She thought about the platform on the night she arrived, the bench, the $17, the nothing waiting east. She thought about Tom Greer picking up the second spade, about Francis Aldrid's face saying he did 17 and they were all right, about a box of old documents that had been sitting in the office for 15 years waiting for someone to go through them. "Both can be true," she said. "Yes," he said, "they can." She turned to look at him and found that he was already looking at her, and the distance between them was less than she'd registered, and neither of them moved for a moment. "I'm not in a position to make promises," she said. It came out more quietly than she intended. "Not with all of this still unresolved, not with Vane still." "I'm not asking for promises," he said. "I'm asking if you want to be here." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had taken off his hat on an empty platform, who had said "you're right" in the same breath as the objection, who had rearranged the supper schedule so she'd eat. "Yes," she said, "I want to be here." Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Then he handed her back the cup she'd missed a spot on, and she laughed, actually laughed, short and surprised, and finished washing it, and that was that, except that it wasn't, and they both knew it. January came in like it intended to stay. The snowfall that arrived in the first week was not unusual for Colorado. Heavy, fast, thorough, the kind that buried fence posts and made the morning feeding of cattle a full-body commitment against wind that felt personally hostile. Rhett and the hands spent the first 3 days of January moving cattle from the eastern pasture where the snow had drifted highest, which meant Eliza ran the ranch house and managed the supply distribution and kept the stove going and did not see Rhett except at supper, which he ate fast and went back out. She had stopped finding it strange, the pace of physical labor on a working ranch. She had found it alarming at first, the sheer unrelenting demand of it, but she'd adjusted to it the way she adjusted to most things, which was by understanding the internal logic and working with it, rather than against it. The ranch had rhythms. She'd learned them. She worked within them. But on the 5th night of January, she woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she couldn't immediately classify. She lay still in her bed and listened. The wind was up. That was part of it, the low constant pressure of winter wind against the walls. But underneath it was something else. A voice. Outside. She got up and went to the window. The yard was lit by snow-reflected moonlight, which gave it a flat gray quality that made shapes hard to read. She could see the barn, the water trough, the fence line, and 2 men near the far end of the fence line, one of them carrying something she couldn't identify at this distance. She was dressed and downstairs before she'd fully decided to be. She took the lantern from the hall table rather than lighting a lamp. She didn't want light visible in the windows before she knew what was happening. She went to the hall closet. She took down the shotgun. She unlocked the back door and went out. The cold was a physical blow even through her coat, and her breath made vapor in the lantern light. She moved along the side of the ranch house toward the barn, listening, keeping the light low. The wind was working in her favor. It covered sound from both directions. She cleared the corner of the barn and stopped. The 2 men were at the far water gate, the secondary gate that directed creek water into the cattle pens. One of them was working at the gate mechanism with something. The other was watching the main house. She raised the shotgun. "Stop," she said. Not shouted. Said, clearly, in the cold air. Both men froze. "Step back from the gate," she said. "Both of you. Hands where I can see them." There was a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, where the situation could have gone any direction. She was aware of it the way you were aware of a flame near dry wood. Then one of the men said something low to the other, and they both stepped back, and she could see now what the first one had been using on the gate mechanism. An iron tool. A long-handled one, the kind used for forcing bolts. They were in the process of destroying the water gate. "Tom!" she called, loud enough to carry to the bunkhouse. "Tom Greer!" She kept the shotgun level and did not look away from the 2 men while she called, even though part of her was listening hard for any sound of movement behind her. She could feel her heartbeat in her hands. She kept her hands still. The bunkhouse door opened, then voices, then boots on frozen ground. By the time Tom Greer and 2 other hands reached her, the men had not moved. By the time Rhett arrived, he'd been in the barn checking on a cow he'd been worried about, which was why the noise had reached him faster than the house. The situation had simplified into something manageable. The 2 men were not fighters by nature. They were paid hands, not Silas Vane's inner circle, and when confronted by 4 armed people in the dark at 2 in the morning, their appetite for the work evaporated quickly. Rhett looked at the water gate, then at Eliza, then at the iron tool on the ground beside the gate mechanism. "You were in here alone," he said. "Tom got here quickly," she said. "Eliza, you came out here alone with, if I'd waited for Tom, the gate might have been, I know." He stopped. He was doing the thing again, the controlled thing, the thing that looked like stillness but wasn't. He looked at the 2 men, cold, miserable, deeply regretting their evening, and then back at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "You're shaking." "It's January and I forgot my second coat," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he took off his coat, the heavy one he'd been wearing in the barn, and put it over her shoulders without asking, and she let him because it was cold and because arguing about it would have been dishonest on multiple levels. He kept his hand on her shoulder for just a moment. 1 second, maybe 2. Then he turned to Tom and said, "Get them inside. We'll ride to town in the morning." She stayed in the yard after the others had gone in, standing with Rhett's coat over her shoulders and the shotgun in her hands, looking at the water gate. They'd been close. Another 20 minutes, and the gate would have been badly damaged. Not destroyed entirely, but enough. Enough to restrict the flow through the coldest week of the year. Enough to endanger the cattle. Enough to create an emergency that would have consumed every resource the ranch had, including the legal ones. She looked at the iron tool on the ground. She thought, he sent men to do this in the middle of the night in January while a legal proceeding was pending. That was not the action of a man who was confident in his legal position. That was the action of a man who was frightened. Good, she thought, with a clarity that surprised her a little. She picked up the tool. It was heavy and cold and had a distinctive shape, a custom piece, not a standard implement. She carried it inside. She set it on the desk in the office, next to the stack of water documents and the carefully copied prior claim record and the letters from Trent. Evidence had a way of accumulating if you kept your eyes open and didn't throw things away. She was getting very good at not throwing things away. She sat down at the desk, still in Rhett's coat because the office was cold, and it was the middle of the night, and she wrote a detailed account of what she'd seen and heard, with times and descriptions, because she had learned by now that the value of a written account was proportional to how promptly it was made after the event. She wrote until her hand ached. Then she set down the pen and sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought about the spring. The legal hearing, Trent, Croft's testimony, the gathered ranchers, the prior claim document, and all of it was uncertain, genuinely uncertain, in the way that real things were uncertain rather than the theatrical kind. She thought about Silas Vane's men in her yard in the middle of the night. She thought about Rhett's coat on her shoulders, the weight of it. She thought about what she'd said on Christmas evening. "I want to be here." She still meant it. That was either reassuring or frightening, and she hadn't quite decided which. Probably both. She got up, put the coat on the chair, turned down the lamp, and went upstairs to try to sleep. Of the house with its patient, impersonal force, the way Colorado winter worked at everything. Not with malice, just with the long, indifferent certainty of something that had been doing this since before anyone arrived and would keep doing it long after. But the walls held. The house was solid. The gate was intact. And somewhere in the bunkhouse, Tom Greer and 2 ranch hands had stopped something that was supposed to happen in secret in the dark, because a woman had listened to a sound she couldn't classify and gotten out of bed to look. The iron tool sat on the desk in the office for 2 days before Rhett rode into town with it wrapped in burlap under his arm. Eliza had suggested waiting. Not long, just long enough for her to finish the written account she'd started the night of the incident, which she wanted complete and specific before anyone started discussing what had happened in casual terms that might blur the details. She had dated it, signed it, had Tom Greer sign it as a witness to what he'd seen when he arrived in the yard, and had 2 other hands sign statements of their own. She'd done it the morning after, before anyone had time to sleep on it and let memory soften around the edges. Rhett had watched her work through this process without interrupting, which she was beginning to understand was one of his particular qualities. The ability to recognize when someone knew what they were doing and simply stay out of the way of it. It was rarer than it should have been in a man, and she noticed it every time. The town sheriff was a man named Aldous Crane, whom Eliza had not met, but whom Rhett described as honest in the limited way that frontier sheriffs could afford to be, meaning he did his job within the boundaries of what the valley's power structure allowed, and those boundaries had historically included a considerable amount of Silas Vane. Rhett did not say this to discourage her. He said it so she understood the terrain. "He'll listen," Rhett said. "He won't move fast." "Will he move at all?" "If the evidence is clear enough that ignoring it becomes its own problem for him? Yes, he's not corrupt. He's cautious." "There's a difference," Eliza said. "A meaningful one," Rhett agreed. She sent the written accounts with him, all 4 of them signed, dated, with her own account, including the description of the iron tool's distinctive shape, the elongated handle, the offset head, the wear pattern on the grip that suggested regular use by a right-handed man with a larger-than-average hand. She had sketched it too because she had a decent hand for drawing when the subject was something she needed to be precise about, and she thought precision would be useful here. Sheriff Crane, Rhett reported when he returned that afternoon, had looked at the tool and gone quiet. He'd looked at the sketch. He'd looked at the signed accounts. He'd said he'd need to make some inquiries. Did he recognize the tool? Eliza asked. He knew the style, Rhett said. Said it was custom work, not standard issue, made by a smith in Hargrove who did specialty pieces for a limited number of customers. Vane's customers. I'd guess so. Crane didn't say that, but he knew the tool. She nodded slowly. So he'll ask questions. He'll ask careful questions, Rhett said, to people who will give careful answers. And then he'll either come to a conclusion or he'll decide the questions lead somewhere he doesn't want to go. And we can't know which until he does. No, Rhett said. We can't. She accepted this the way she accepted most things she couldn't control, by setting it in a separate category in her mind from the things she could act on, and returning her attention to what was actionable. She had learned this somewhere in the worst of her year in Ohio. Grief and fear consumed the same resource, attention, and attention spent on the uncontrollable was attention taken from the solvable. She wasn't perfect at it. She had nights when the uncontrollable won, and she lay awake cataloging everything that could go wrong until the ceiling turned gray with dawn. But the practice was useful, and she kept at it. What was actionable was the February hearing. 1. Trent had written with the confirmation of dates. The review board would convene in Hargrove on the 14th of February, a date that Mara, when told, said with complete seriousness and zero inflection, would be remembered as either a great love story or a great disaster, and that she personally was prepared for either outcome. I don't know what that means, Eliza said. Yes, you do, Mara said pleasantly, and changed the subject. The 6 weeks between the New Year and the hearing were the kind of sustained, grinding work that didn't make for dramatic stories afterward because there was nothing to point to. Just the accumulation of preparation, letter by letter, document by document, conversation by conversation. Trent came from Denver 10 days before the hearing with 2 associates and took over the sitting room of Mara's boarding house, which Mara arranged with the efficiency of a woman who had never once in her life been rattled by an unexpected demand on her logistics. Eliza met with Trent for 3 days running. He was a man of about 50, lean and dry-voiced, with the kind of mind that moved in precise lateral steps. He would ask a question, receive an answer, file it, and move to the next question without any visible emotional response to anything. She appreciated this. It meant the work went fast. The prior claim document is your strongest piece, he told her on the second day, followed by Croft's testimony regarding the specific alterations. The boundary analysis you've compiled, he tapped the stack of her documented comparisons, is not legally definitive on its own, but it provides context for why the alterations mattered. It shows direction of intent. Will the board accept it? They'll accept it as part of the narrative. Whether they find it persuasive depends on how Vane's counsel presents the counterargument. He paused. His primary argument will be that the prior claim document is unverifiable, that without a surviving signatory or supporting registration, it's historical curiosity rather than legal evidence. All of the original signatories are dead, Eliza said. Yes, his counsel will know that. But the document itself is authentic. The paper, the ink, the handwriting can be tested, and I have arranged for a document examiner from the territorial court in Denver to be present and provide testimony. But document examination is not an exact science at this point in time, and Vane's counsel will present their own opinion if it suits them. She was quiet for a moment. What's our weakest point? He looked at her. She had the impression he was recalibrating again, slightly, in the way she'd noticed people did when they'd expected less directness and received more. The connection between the boundary alterations and Warren Pike's death, he said. We can demonstrate that Vane had motive and opportunity to manipulate the water claims. We cannot, with current evidence, establish that he ordered or directed what happened to Warren. That's a separate legal matter entirely, and pursuing it simultaneously risks muddying both cases. So we leave it. For now, we leave it. One thing at a time. She didn't like it. She could see from the careful flatness of Trent's expression that he understood she didn't like it, and that he was not going to change his assessment on that basis. All right, she said. The goal for the hearing is to establish that the prior claim document is legitimate, that it establishes continuous use rights predating Vane's holdings, and that those rights cannot be extinguished by boundary language alterations and subsequent informal agreements. If we establish those three things, the review board's preliminary ruling should protect Iron Creek's water draw for the duration of the full proceedings. And the other ranches? Henderson, Aldred, and the others with claims on the same document? He considered. The prior claim document names them all. If it's authenticated, they're covered under the same argument, which is why Vane's counsel will work hardest to exclude it. Eliza looked at the copy of the document, her careful copy, made on the night she'd found it, while Rhett was down the hall. She thought about Rhett's father's handwriting in those ledgers, the meticulous, unglamorous work of recording things, the years of careful documentation that no one had thought to look at until a stranded woman with nothing else to do had started going through old boxes. Then we make sure it isn't excluded, she said. Rhett had been riding the neighboring properties through January with the quiet persistence of a man who understood that trust was built in increments and couldn't be rushed. He came back from each ride with a different kind of tired, not physical exhaustion, which she'd watched him absorb without complaint all winter, but the kind that came from navigating people's fear, which was a heavier load. Henderson had committed. He was angry and ready and had been, as Rhett had predicted, waiting for a direction to point it. He came to Iron Creek on a Thursday with his hat in his hands and his jaw set and said to Eliza, directly, looking at her as the person who apparently knew what was happening, "You tell me what you need from me and I'll do it. I need your signature on a joint filing that establishes all named parties in the prior claim document as co-petitioners," she said, "and I need you to be in Hargrove on February 14th. "Done," he said. He shook her hand, a brief, firm, entirely unself-conscious gesture, and then went to find Rhett to talk cattle, which was apparently the order of business he considered more comfortable territory. The Aldreds came around more slowly. Frances had been quietly in favor from the moment she'd understood what the prior claim document meant, but her husband Ellis was a cautious man who had spent 3 years carefully not antagonizing Silas Vane and didn't immediately see the wisdom in stopping. He and Rhett had 2 long conversations that Rhett reported on with careful neutrality. Ellis's concerns were legitimate, his risk assessment was rational given his family's situation, and pressuring him would be counterproductive. It was Eliza who finally talked to Frances directly, on a Tuesday afternoon when Frances brought Tom by for his arithmetic lesson and stayed for coffee after the other children had gone home. She didn't make a case. She just told Frances what the prior claim document contained, what it meant, and what would happen if it was authenticated, that every property named in it had established use rights that predated Vane's ownership and couldn't legally be erased by subsequent manipulation. She laid it out the way she laid out accounts, clearly, without embellishment, letting the numbers speak. Frances listened with her hands wrapped around her cup and her eyes sharp and thoughtful. "Ellis is afraid of what happens if it doesn't work," Frances said. "I know," Eliza said. "That's a reasonable fear." "What do you say to that?" Eliza considered it honestly. "I say that what's already happening, gradually, quietly, over years, is Vane removing your options one at a time until you don't have any. The risk of fighting is real, but the cost of not fighting is the same outcome, just slower." She paused. "I can't promise you it works. I can promise you that if it doesn't, it won't be because we didn't do it right." Frances looked at her for a moment. "You're not going to tell me it'll definitely be fine." "No," Eliza said. "I'm not." Frances nodded slowly. "Ellis will sign," she said. "I'll tell him tonight." The Denny family was the last and the hardest. Their entanglement with Vane was older and more complicated, and their reluctance had a specific texture. Not just fear, but something closer to shame, the particular discomfort of people who had made a deal they regretted and didn't know how to step back from it. Rhett spent 3 separate evenings at their place before they'd agree to meet with Trent, and when they finally did, Trent handled it in the direct, undramatic way he handled most things, which was apparently what they'd needed. Not persuasion, but simply the legal facts laid out without judgment. They signed. When all 5 properties were committed, Rhett came back to the ranch on a Thursday evening and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Eliza with an expression that was quiet and specific. "It's done," he said. "Not done," she said. "The hearing is—" "The signing," he said. "Getting everyone together. That part." He put his hands flat on the table. I've been asking scared people to do something hard for 6 weeks. And they did it, she said. Because you laid the groundwork, he said. Half of them said yes because of what you'd built here. Henderson said, Calder, if that woman thinks it's worth doing, I believe her. He paused. That's not nothing. Eliza was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands on the table, the ink stain on her right forefinger that had been there for 3 weeks because it was winter and cold, and she was working too much to be careful about it. Trent thinks we're ready, she said. Are we? As ready as we can be, she said, which isn't the same thing, and I'm not going to pretend it is. He looked at her steadily. I know, he said. Then, after a moment, I've been thinking about something. She waited. After, he said. Not qualified, not conditional, just after, as if he was taking the outcome as settled, which she suspected was deliberate. I want to talk about after. What about it? He was doing the threshold thing again, even sitting down, that pause before the thing he'd decided to say. I want to court you properly, he said. I haven't said it plainly because there's been too much else, and I was trying not to add weight to an already weighted situation, but I think not saying it plainly has been its own kind of problem. She looked at him. I want to say it plainly, he said. After the hearing, if you'll allow it. You said that on the mountain, she said, in the fall. I said it in the middle of a thunderstorm when I'd been building up to it for 3 months, he said. You said yes. And then December happened, and January happened, and I've been... He stopped. I want to do it properly. When this is done. She held his eyes for a moment. His face was exactly what it always was. Direct, a little rough at the edges, not performing anything, just a man saying the thing he meant. After the hearing, she said. After the hearing, he agreed. It was not a romantic conversation in the conventional sense. They were sitting at a kitchen table in January with ink on her fingers and mud on his boots, and a legal hearing in 3 weeks that could go either way. But it was honest, and it was specific, and it was the kind of promise she trusted, not because it was elaborate, but because it came from a man who had not once in 6 months told her anything that wasn't true. The day before the hearing, something happened that none of them had anticipated. Sheriff Crane came to Iron Creek Ranch in the afternoon, alone, which was itself a piece of information. A man making an official call brought a deputy. A man coming alone was doing something more complicated. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and turned the cup in his hands the way people did when they were organizing what they'd come to say. The tool, he said finally. Eliza and Rhett both waited. The smith in Hargrove confirmed the style. Custom work, like I thought. Made a set of 6 for the same buyer about 3 years back. He looked at his coffee. I can't tell you who the buyer was, professionally. You understand? Yes, Rhett said. I also can't. There are things I can't do without evidence that meets a specific standard. Accusations require a level of proof that I don't have in my hands. What I have is a tool at a scene and a confirmation of manufacture style, and a buyer whose name I'm not able to use officially. I understand that, Rhett said. Crane looked at him, then at Eliza. What I can do is appear at the hearing tomorrow as a representative of this county's law enforcement and state on the record that an incident of property interference occurred at Iron Creek Ranch on the night of January 6th, that the incident involved an identified tool of specific manufacture, and that an investigation into the incident is ongoing. He set his cup down. That's what I can do. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That's significant, Eliza said carefully. It's what the evidence supports, Crane said. It's nothing more than that. No, she said. Of course not. He looked at her, and something in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition, shifted briefly. Miss Whitmore, he said, the written accounts you prepared, the sketch of the tool, the witness signatures. He paused. That was good work. She didn't thank him effusively. He hadn't said it to be thanked. I wrote down what I saw, she said. Most people don't, he said, and stood up. He shook Rhett's hand, nodded to Eliza, and left. Rhett looked at her after Crane's horse had gone from the yard. He just told us he knows it was vain, he said. He told us he has a professional limitation on what he can say officially, she said, and that within that limitation, he's going to do what he can. That's the same thing. It's meaningfully different in terms of what we can expect from him, she said. Don't count on more than what he said. Rhett looked at her for a moment. How are you this? He stopped. This what? He shook his head slightly, not like he'd given up on the thought, but like he'd decided to say it differently later. Get some sleep tonight, he said instead. Big day tomorrow. She did try to sleep. She managed some of it. She lay in the dark and went through the documents in her head in the order Trent had arranged them. The prior claim document first, then the boundary analysis, then Croft, then the incident accounts, and Crane's testimony. She looked for gaps. She found two she didn't love but couldn't close, and she made herself accept them and move on, which was the only thing to do with gaps you couldn't close. At some point before dawn, she stopped going through documents and started thinking about Rhett saying after. Just that one word with the weight of everything it contained. And she let herself think about it for a few minutes because she was too tired to maintain the careful distance she usually kept from the thought. She had come to Briar Hollow in the fall with nothing and nowhere and a $17 future. She had not, in all the months since, stopped moving. There had always been the next account, the next document, the next problem, the next lesson, the next crisis. She had been grateful for that, mostly. It gave her no time for the particular kind of fear that lived in stillness. But lying there in the dark the night before the hearing, she let herself be still for a moment and look at what she'd built in 6 months in this valley. And it was not what she'd planned. It was not what she'd expected. It was not the safe, settled, clearly defined life she'd been trying to buy with a train ticket and a promise. It was something stranger and more specific and considerably more hers. The morning came the way February mornings came in Colorado, cold, clean, uncompromising. She got up, dressed carefully in her best dress, the gray one she'd pressed the night she arrived, which felt like a private acknowledgement of something she didn't say aloud, and went downstairs. Rhett was already in the kitchen. He'd made coffee, which was not something he usually did. That was usually her territory. And he poured a cup and handed it to her when she came through the door without saying anything. She took it, drank, looked at him over the rim. I was wearing his good coat, the one he'd worn in Denver, and he had the particular set to his shoulders of a man who had decided to be ready regardless of what the day brought. Trent will meet us there at 9, he said. I know. Henderson's riding in from the north. Aldred's and the Denny's are coming together in the Aldred wagon. I know that too. He looked at her. In the early kitchen light, she could see the tiredness in his face. He hadn't slept well either, she could tell, not from looking haggard, but from the particular quality of awareness in his eyes that came from a night spent thinking rather than resting. However it goes today, he said. Don't, she said. He stopped. Don't finish that sentence, she said. It'll make me nervous and I can't afford to be nervous right now. He was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly, all right. They rode to Hargrove in the wagon in the cold and didn't say much, which was exactly what she needed. The review board convened at 10 o'clock in the county courthouse, a building that was more practical than dignified. Its main room fitted with benches and a long table at the front where 3 board members sat with the focused expressions of men who had been handed a complicated situation and were not entirely happy about it. The room was crowded. That was the first thing that caught Eliza. She had expected the ranchers, Trent's people, Vane's contingent, and perhaps some observers. She had not expected the room to be nearly full. Ranchers she recognized and some she didn't. Women who'd come with their husbands. The schoolteacher from town. 2 men from the feed store. Mara, in the second row, wearing her best hat, with the composure of a woman who intended to witness every word. She had not organized this. She looked at Rhett. Word travels, he said simply. Silas Vane was already at the front of the room when they arrived, seated to the left at a table with 2 lawyers, city lawyers, well-dressed, the kind who carried their competence in the cut of their coats. He looked across the room when Rhett and Eliza entered, and his gaze found her specifically, and she met it for one clear second and then looked away. Not from weakness. She simply didn't need to look at him anymore. Trent was at the opposite table, arranging documents with his methodical precision. He nodded to her when she sat behind the rail, and she read in his nod that he was ready, and felt some of the tight coil in her chest ease by a fraction. The hearing took 4 hours. It was not dramatic in the way that things in stories were dramatic. There was no single moment of revelation, No gasping crowd, no devastating speech that turned the tide in one brilliant swing. What it was, instead, was exactly what Trent had prepared. Careful, documented, sequential presentation of evidence, layer by layer, building the case the way she built accounts, methodically, with no gap left unfilled. Vane's counsel moved to exclude the prior claim document 4 separate times. Trent countered each motion. The document examiner from Denver testified to the paper's consistency with the period and the ink composition's compatibility with records from the era. He acknowledged, when pressed, that absolute certainty was not possible. This was honest, and Trent had told her it would happen, but stated that nothing in his examination gave reason to question authenticity. Croft testified. He was a small, anxious man who sweated even in the February cold, and who answered questions with the mechanical precision of someone who had rehearsed this enough that he'd worn down his fear of it to a manageable size. Vane's counsel went after him hard on his own culpability. He had, after all, been the one who physically altered the documents, and Croft absorbed it without breaking, which Eliza suspected was because he had already made his peace with the portion of blame that was genuinely his, and that clarity, ugly as it was steadier ground than the alternative. Sheriff Crane testified briefly, precisely, exactly as he'd described he would. Eliza testified regarding her analysis, the boundary discrepancies, the accumulation of small alterations across multiple documents, the directional consistency of the changes. Vane's counsel questioned her qualifications, her period of employment, the potential for bias as a party with interest in the outcome. She answered each question directly. She did not get flustered. She did not apologize for knowing what she knew. She said, when asked what qualified her to interpret water boundary documents, the same thing that qualifies anyone, the ability to read, to compare, and to identify when 2 descriptions of the same physical location are not describing the same place. One of the board members almost smiled. At the break midway through, Rhett found her in the corridor outside. "You're doing well," he said. "I'm doing what Trent prepared me to do," she said. "You're doing it well." She appreciated that he didn't elaborate. She needed her focus, and they both understood it. The afternoon session was where Vane's counsel made their strongest play. They presented their own documentary analysis, hired experts, broader in scope than Croft's specific alterations, arguing that water boundary imprecision was endemic throughout the Valley's informal agreement history, and that singling out Vane's holdings was selective and politically motivated. They questioned the legal standing of the prior claim document under current territorial water law. They argued that even if the document was authentic, its informal nature meant it constituted a record of intent rather than a legally binding instrument. Trent's rebuttal was the best thing Eliza had seen him do. He was economical, precise, and brutal in the quiet way of someone who knew exactly where the argument's weight was and didn't waste language getting there. The prior claim document, he argued, did not need to meet current territorial registration standards because it predated those standards entirely. It was evidence of established use, not a claim under current law, and established use was its own category with its own legal weight. Vane's counsel's argument, he said, would require the board to pretend the prior claim document did not exist, rather than interpret what it meant. The board recessed to deliberate at 3:30. The room did not clear. People sat and stood and spoke in low voices, and Eliza sat on the bench beside Rhett and Mara and held her hands in her lap and waited. She was aware of Henderson a row behind her, his jaw set. The Aldrids across the aisle, Ellis with his hand on Francis's, and Francis watching the front of the room with steady eyes. The Denny's at the end of the row, quiet and contained. Rhett, beside her, did not say anything. He sat with his forearms on his knees and his hat in his hands, and she was aware of the warmth of his arm against hers and did not move away. The board came back in 45 minutes. The chair, a heavy-set man named Briggs, who had the manner of someone who'd been on boards long enough to have seen most things, read the preliminary ruling in the flat, measured voice of a man delivering information rather than performing it. The prior claim document was accepted as legitimate evidence of established use. Its authenticity was not ruled upon definitively. That would require full proceedings. But it was sufficient to establish a preliminary claim of continuous use rights for all named properties. Pending full review, no restriction of water access for any named property along Iron Creek would be imposed. The allegations of deliberate boundary manipulation would be referred to the county attorney's office for further investigation. Silas Vane would not be gaining unchallenged control of the creek. Not today. Not pending a full review that would now include Croft's testimony and the prior claim document and the incident report from January 6th and whatever the county attorney's investigation would uncover. The room did not erupt. It was not that kind of room. These were working people, not crowd scenes. What happened was more specific. Henderson exhaled, a sound Eliza heard clearly 2 rows back. Frances Aldred pressed her husband's hand hard. Mara, in the second row, sat very straight and looked straight ahead with the expression of a woman keeping her composure by force of will and doing it beautifully. Eliza did not move. She sat and felt the ruling settle into place like a piece in an account that finally balanced. Not finished. Full proceedings were months away. The county attorney investigation was new and uncertain. Silas Vane was still a powerful man with considerable resources and no shortage of patience for the long game. It was not over, but it had turned. The direction of it had turned. She felt Rhett's hand close over hers on the bench, just for a moment, brief, steady, not a performance. She didn't look at him. She just turned her hand over so it was palm up and held on for that moment before letting go, because there were people watching, and because this was not the time for any of that. But she held on. Across the room, Silas Vane was conferring with his lawyers in a low, contained voice. He did not look across the room. He did not look at her. She watched him for a moment with the calm assessment she had learned to maintain under his gaze, and she registered what she saw. A man recalculating. Not defeated. Men like Silas Vane did not crumble in a single afternoon, but recalculating, adjusting, looking for the next angle. There would be more. She was certain of it. But he was looking for the next angle because this one hadn't worked, and that was something he hadn't needed to do before. And that too was something. Trent appeared at her elbow. "Well done," he said in his dry, economical way. The investigation referral was more than I'd anticipated. "Is it real?" she asked. "The investigation?" "It depends on the county attorney's appetite for it, but it's on the record now, which means it can't be simply not done. Vane's lawyers know that." He looked across the room toward Vane's table. "He'll settle," he said. "Eventually. Men in his position calculate costs. When the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of retreat, they retreat. We haven't reached that threshold yet, but we're moving toward it." "We are," Trent said, steadily. She thanked him. He nodded, already gathering papers. Henderson found her before they'd even reached the door. He shook her hand again. The same firm, brief, entirely unself-conscious gesture as before, and said, "Whatever happens next, you tell me what's needed." "I will," she said. Frances Aldred embraced her quickly, which surprised them both, and then pulled back with the expression of a woman who had surprised herself and was not entirely regretting it. Outside in the February cold, the sky was going flat blue, and the sun was already low, and the air had that particular sharp quality of a winter afternoon in the mountains. The group of them stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. The ranchers, Trent's people, Mara, Eliza, Rhett, in that particular way that happened after something significant, before the practical demands of the evening reasserted themselves. Rhett stood beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence in the way she'd come to feel it, as something specific, something she'd calibrated to without deciding to. "You said one word this morning," she said, "before we left." "I said a few things this morning," he said. "You said after," she said, "before I stopped you." He looked at her. "I'm saying now that I heard it," she said, "and that I'm holding you to it." Something in his face shifted, not dramatic, just that half-second change she'd learned to watch for, the one that was his version of a broad gesture. "Good," he said. Around them, the valley was winter cold and unsettled and unfinished, with months of legal proceedings still ahead, and a powerful man still calculating his next move from across a courthouse room. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was certain. But Eliza Whitmore, who had arrived in Briar Hollow with $17 and nowhere to go, stood on a courthouse step in February and felt the particular solidity of ground she had helped to build beneath her own feet, and found that the uncertainty did not frighten her the way it once had. She had earned her footing here, every inch of it. That was not something anyone could take a boundary description to. The ride back from Hargrove took longer than the ride out, not because the road was worse, though it was, the afternoon cold having stiffened the ruts into something that jarred the wagon with every half mile, but because nobody was in a hurry. Rhett drove. Eliza sat beside him on the bench with a blanket across her lap and the mountains turning purple in the low winter light ahead of them. And neither of them spoke much, and it was the comfortable kind of silence that had nothing left to prove. Mara had gone back separately with Henderson, who was apparently her neighbor's cousin by some complicated rural arithmetic, and the Aldreds and Dennies had their own wagons, so it was just the two of them, and the horse, and the road, and the sound of iron wheels on frozen ground. She was tired in a way that lived behind her eyes and down into her shoulders. Not the sharp exhaustion of crisis, but the slow drain of sustained tension finally releasing. 4 months of careful, quiet, relentless work. 4 months of documents and letters and measured words and controlled fear. She had not let herself feel the full weight of it while she was inside it, because feeling it would have slowed her down, and she couldn't afford to slow down. She was feeling it now. "You're quiet," Rhett said. "I'm always quiet," she said. "You're a different kind of quiet." She considered this. "I'm tired," she said. "In a way I haven't let myself be until now." He nodded, eyes on the road. "That's fair." She looked at the mountains. "Do you think he'll settle?" Trent said eventually. "Trent's right," Rhett said. "Eventually. But Silas isn't a man who moves fast toward retreat. He'll probe first. Look for a weak point, something new to try. He'll take stock of what he still has and what he's lost and calculate from there. He's still a powerful man." "Yes." "The county attorney investigation might go nowhere." "It might," Rhett said. "Crane will do what he can. Whether the attorney has the appetite for it," he exhaled, "that's not something we can control." She knew that. She had filed the investigation under the uncontrollable category and was trying to leave it there. "What can we control?" "The hearing," he said. "Full proceedings in the spring, making sure every named property on that document shows up with everything they have. Keeping Trent engaged and informed," he paused, "and buying Warren's old property before someone else does." She turned to look at him. He was still watching the road, but she could see the line of his jaw, the deliberate quality of someone who'd been thinking about what they wanted to say for a while. "Warren's ranch has been sitting empty since fall," he said. "His estate will put it up for sale in the spring. If Silas gets hold of it, he controls access to the southern end of the creek," she said. She'd thought of this. Of course she'd thought of this. She'd been not thinking about it deliberately because the financial mathematics of it were not comfortable. But buying it would cost nearly everything we have in reserve. "Nearly," he said. "The legal proceedings are ongoing. If we drain the reserve, I know the risk," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "There's another way," she said. He glanced at her. "Not Iron Creek buying it alone," she said. "The other ranchers. Joint purchase. Shared title. The same model that would apply to water rights. No single owner. A cooperative agreement that guarantees everyone's access and prevents any one party from controlling access for the others." She heard herself working through it as she said it, the way she did when an idea was real rather than theoretical. "The cost spread across 5 properties is manageable. The legal structure would take some doing, but Trent could draft it," Rhett said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Not resistant. She'd learned to distinguish his thinking silence from his disagreement silence, and these were not the same. "The Dennies might not have the capital," he said. "Then we structure their share differently. Smaller initial stake, larger labor contribution during roundups. There are ways to make it equitable without making it identical." He looked at her then, took his eyes off the road for a moment, which she knew he didn't do casually. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since November," she said. "I didn't bring it up because it wasn't the right time." "And now it is?" "Now it might be," she said, "if you think it's worth pursuing." He turned back to the road. The horse's breath made vapor in the cold air. The mountains had gone from purple to a deep flat blue at the edges. "I think," he said carefully, "that it's the kind of idea that changes what this valley is." He paused. "Not just who controls the water, what kind of place it is. Whether people here survive by competing or by holding together." "Yes," she said. "That's what I think too." He didn't say anything else for a while. She didn't either. The idea sat between them in the cold, and she let it exist without pressing it, because it was big enough to need room. March came in cold and went out colder, which was Colorado's particular version of a joke. The full proceedings were scheduled for April, which gave them 6 weeks. 6 weeks that were simultaneously too short and the longest 6 weeks Eliza could remember living through. The ranch work didn't pause for legal proceedings. The cattle needed feeding, and the fences needed checking, and the mud season arrived with its own specific set of miseries, including a stretch of 2 weeks in which the access road from the ranch to the main trail became navigable only on horseback, which meant supply runs happened on horseback, and anything that required a wagon waited. Tom Greer fell and cracked 2 ribs in the 3rd week of March, which meant his work was redistributed among the other hands, which meant Eliza took on more of the outdoor work than she'd been doing, which meant she spent 3 days doing things she was not expert at and making up for inexpertise with sheer stubborn persistence, which was, she reflected, somewhat characteristic of her approach to most things. Rhett worked beside her during those 3 days without making a production of it. He corrected her when she was doing something wrong, directly, without softening it into something more comfortable, which she found she preferred over the alternative. And he didn't comment when she got something right, which she also preferred, because the work getting done was its own acknowledgement. On the 3rd day, she was repairing a section of fence in the cold mud, and her hands were aching, and her back was complaining, and she hit the fence post wrong with the mallet, and the whole thing shifted sideways, and she said something she generally didn't say, loudly enough to be heard at a moderate distance. Rhett, working on the next section, looked over. "You want help with that?" he said. "I want to do it correctly," she said through her teeth. "Those 2 things aren't mutually exclusive," he said. She looked at him. He was using her own phrase back at her. She remembered saying it to Tom Greer back in November about the bunkhouse wall, and she was fairly certain he remembered that too, from the specific quality of the straight face he was keeping. She laughed, short and reluctant, and then more genuine than she intended. The kind of laugh that came out of you when you were tired and frustrated and cold, and something caught you sideways. He came over and helped her reset the post, and she held it while he drove it correctly, and neither of them said anything about it, and when it was done, she went back to work, and so did he. That evening, he asked her to walk with him to the ridge above the ranch before dark, which was a thing he'd never asked before. They went up separately sometimes, but not together. She went, because she was tired of being inside, and because she wanted to see the sky. And they walked up the frozen slope in the late afternoon light without talking much. And at the top, she looked out over the valley and felt the particular thing she'd been feeling here since November that she hadn't named yet. Home was the only word for it, and it surprised her every time she let herself notice it. "Tell me something," he said beside her. "What?" "What you thought this was going to be," he said. "When you got on the train." She thought about it honestly. "Safe," she said. "I thought it was going to be safe. A structure. A defined life with defined edges. I knew it would be hard work. I wasn't romantic about that, but I thought the shape of it would be clear." She paused. "A ranch. A husband. A role that was known. And instead I got off a train and everything was wrong," she said. "And then gradually everything was different, which is not the same thing as wrong." He looked at her. The light was going fast. Winter sunsets were abrupt in the mountains. "I had a life that was very small," he said, "after Sarah died." His wife, she knew. He'd mentioned her twice, briefly, in the way of someone who kept something in a protected place and opened it carefully. Not small as in poor, small as in, I stopped planning things. I managed what was in front of me. That was enough. I told myself it was enough. Was it? For a while, he said. Then it wasn't, and I didn't know what to do about that. He looked back out over the valley. And then there was a woman sitting on a platform bench in the dark with $17 and nowhere to go. She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't anyone's rescue project," she said. Not sharply, just precisely. "I know that," he said. "You weren't. You were just someone who needed a meal and a safe room, and I had both." He paused. "What happened after that was your doing, not mine." She looked at him. In the failing light, his face was the face she'd come to know in this particular way. Not romantic inventory, but something more specific. The face of a person you'd stood beside in difficult situations and found reliable. That was its own kind of intimacy, and a more durable one. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to take it seriously." "When have I not taken you seriously?" she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Eliza. He turned to face her properly, which was its own signal. He didn't do things for effect, so when something changed in his posture, it meant something. I want to marry you. I want to say that plainly before the proceedings, before the purchase, before any of the rest of it, so that none of those things are tangled up in why I'm asking. I'm asking because I want to build what comes next with you, because the past 6 months has shown me exactly what that would mean, and I want it. He stopped. That's what I want. What do you want? The wind moved through the grass on the ridge. Below them, the ranch lights were coming on in the windows, small and warm in the gathering dark. Eliza had come west for security from a stranger. She had planned, very carefully, for a particular kind of future. She had been wrong about almost everything she'd anticipated and right about almost none of it, and the life she'd found instead was harder and stranger and more fully occupied than anything she'd imagined on the train. She thought about her mother, about the school board and their polite dismissal, about $17 and a bench in a town she'd never heard of. She thought about a box of old documents that had been sitting in an office for 15 years waiting for someone to care enough to go through them. Yes, she said. It came out simpler than she'd expected. Not dramatic, just true. He didn't reach for her immediately. He stood there for a moment, like a man absorbing something he'd wanted long enough that having it required a second to become real. Then he took her hand, her left hand, cold in the winter air, and held it in both of his, and that was that. They stood on the ridge until the dark came fully, and the ranch lights below were the only warmth visible in the valley, and then they walked back down together. April arrived, and with it, everything at once. The spring thaw came in a rush that turned the roads to rivers for 2 weeks, and then dried them into something workable in the third. Warren Pike's estate officially advertised the ranch for sale. The joint purchase agreement, which Trent had drafted over 2 weeks of back and forth with all 5 properties, and which was, he told Eliza with something approaching admiration, one of the more structurally unusual documents he'd ever prepared, was ready for signatures. And the full water rights proceedings were set for the 20th of April in Hargrove. 3 things, converging. The property purchase was signed on April 15th, all 5 ranches. The Denny's had come in on a modified stake, lower capital, extended contribution agreement over 5 years, which had taken 2 separate conversations with Ellis Denny about whether it was charity and 1 conversation with Francis Denny about whether Ellis's pride was worth more than his children's future access to water. And after the second conversation, the matter was settled. Henderson put in the largest capital share and did so without ceremony, and with the specific satisfaction of a man spending money on something that personally annoyed Silas Vane. When they signed, all 5 parties in Trent's makeshift conference room at the boarding house, Mara brought out coffee and something she'd baked, and nobody made a speech because they were working people and speeches were not the idiom of working people. What happened instead was that Henderson shook hands with Ellis Denny, and Ellis shook hands back with the slightly rigid formality of a man practicing trust he hadn't fully built yet, and Francis Aldred said quietly to Eliza, "This is the right thing." And Eliza said, "Yes," and that was the ceremony. Rhett looked at her across the table when it was done. She looked back. There was nothing that needed saying. Oh, the full proceedings in Hargrove were different from the February hearing in one specific way. Silas Vane did not appear. His lawyers were there. 3 of them now, which was an increase that Trent noted with a professional's appreciation for the signal it sent. You didn't bring more lawyers to a fight you expected to win easily. But Vane himself was absent, and his absence was the kind that meant something. Men who were confident showed up. Men who were managing a deteriorating position sent representatives. The county attorney's office had not been idle in the intervening months. The investigation that Sheriff Crane had set in motion had been quiet, but not inactive. They had spoken to the smith in Hargrove, who had confirmed the buyer of the custom tools. They had spoken to 2 of Vane's former employees who had been quietly let go in the months since January, and who had, it turned out, been let go in ways that left them feeling expendable rather than grateful. Men who felt expendable were, as Eliza had observed to Rhett back in November, sometimes more interested in insurance than loyalty. The county attorney did not charge Silas Vane with anything that April. Not with Warren's death, not with the water manipulation, not with the January sabotage. The threshold for criminal charges was high, and the evidence, while persuasive, was not yet at that threshold. But the investigation was ongoing and now on the formal record, and Vane's lawyers knew what that meant for any future proceedings. The full board ruled on the water rights in a 3-hour session. The prior claim document was ruled legitimate. The established use rights of all 7 named properties, 5 original properties, plus 2 absorbed into the current filing, were confirmed as predating and therefore superseding any subsequent boundary alterations in informal agreements. The alterations themselves were formally noted as the subject of ongoing investigation. Iron Creek Ranch's water rights were confirmed in full. All 5 cooperative properties were confirmed in full. Silas Vane's claimed water boundaries were reduced to what his original legitimate holdings had supported before the manipulation, which was, Trent explained afterward with the flat precision he used for all information regardless of its significance, approximately 60% of what he'd been drawing. He had built a decade of financial and social power in this valley on the assumption that he could quietly take what he wanted a piece at a time and that nobody would ever pull the pieces together and see the whole shape. Someone had. She was standing outside the courthouse in April sun when Trent found her. His lawyers reached out this morning, he said, before the ruling. She looked at him. They want to discuss settlement terms, he said, for the civil proceedings, the compensation claims from the affected ranches. He's settling. He's opening settlement discussions, Trent said carefully. It's not the same thing yet, but it's the calculation I described. He folded his hands. When the cost exceeds what can be gained by continuing, he's there. She looked out at the street. The Colorado spring had arrived without much ceremony. The mountains still had snow on them, but the valley was green and the sky was the particular clean blue that followed winter like an apology. What will settlement mean for the properties? She asked. For the affected ranches, real compensation, if we negotiate correctly. Enough to make the past years of restricted access worth something going forward. For Iron Creek specifically, given your role in the documentation. He paused. I think we can make a strong argument. Don't negotiate anything without consulting the other ranchers, she said. All of them. Whatever we reach has to work for everyone. That was the point. He looked at her with that recalibrating expression she'd seen enough times to find almost fond. I'll set up a meeting, he said. The settlement took 3 months to negotiate. Eliza sat in on most of the sessions, which Vane's lawyers initially objected to on the grounds that she was not a named party to the proceedings. Trent informed them that she was the primary author of the documentary analysis that formed the evidentiary backbone of the entire case, and that her presence was at the discretion of the parties she represented, and that if they had concerns, they could raise them with the board, and they did not raise them with the board. She said little in those sessions. She listened. She passed notes to Trent occasionally. Once, when Vane's lead counsel made an argument about the documentation that she knew was factually inaccurate, not strategically inflated, actually wrong, she leaned over and wrote 3 words on Trent's notepad, and he read them, looked at her, and then proceeded to dismantle the argument in approximately 90 seconds, using the exact document she'd identified. After that session, Vane's lead counsel looked at her for a moment on the way out of the room. Not Trent. Her. She met his gaze with the same pleasant emptiness she'd maintained in the general store 5 months ago, and he looked away first. The final settlement terms were signed in July. Silas Vane compensated all 5 cooperative properties for documented losses related to water restriction over the preceding 3 years. The amounts varied by property, calculated from records Eliza had been helping all 5 ranches compile since March, and none of them were enough to replace what those years had actually cost in human terms. That was the reality of settlement. It was an accounting of measurable loss, not a restoration of what couldn't be measured. But it was real money. For the Denny's, it meant paying off the debt structure that had entangled them with Vane in the first place, which Francis told Eliza with a flat matter-of-factness was worth more than the dollar amount attached to it. For Henderson, it meant equipment he'd been deferring for 3 years. For the Aldreds, it meant repairing the section of their property that had suffered from restricted water access long enough to leave actual damage. Vane sold 2 of his largest holdings in the valley that autumn. Not all at once. He was still a man with resources, and men with resources did not simply evaporate. But the selling began. The pressure that had kept the valley operating in his long shadow began, incrementally, to lift. He was not broken. He was diminished. For a man who had confused his power in Briar Hollow with something permanent, diminishment was its own particular punishment, and Eliza found she did not need him to be broken to feel that something right had happened. She was not built for revenge. She was built for things working correctly, and they were working more correctly now. The county attorney formally charged two of Silas Vane's longtime associates in September, not Vane himself, but the men who had been most directly involved in Warren Pike's death. The charges were assault resulting in death, a lesser charge than murder but a real one, and the evidence was sufficient. Croft had provided information that connected the water dispute timeline to the specific events of the night Warren died, and two of the former employees who'd been let go in January had provided testimony that placed Vane's men at the location. Vane was named as a person of interest in the ongoing investigation. He was not charged. Not then. Whether he ever would be was something that lived in the uncontrollable category, and Eliza had made her peace with that category a long time ago. Warren had been a decent man who had written about the color of sky at dawn and thought it made him feel small in a way that wasn't frightening. He deserved more than what he got. He deserved a full accounting, and whether that accounting came through legal channels eventually, or whether it came in the slower currency of a man's reputation and power collapsing around him, she didn't know. She held the question open and refused to let it consume her. What she could control was what she did next. They married in May, before the settlement was finished, because Rhett said he was not interested in waiting for everything to resolve before living the life in front of him, and because Eliza, who had spent a year being practical about things that required practicality, agreed that some things did not benefit from waiting. It was not a large wedding. It was not a small one either. It turned out that the Valley had opinions about this particular union, and those opinions were, by and large, warmly expressed. Henderson came. The Aldreds and Denny's came. Tom Greer wore his good shirt, which she had previously not known existed, and stood at the edge of the gathering with the expression of a man who found ceremonies uncomfortable but had decided this one was worth the discomfort. Francis Aldred's boy Tom gave Eliza a drawing he'd made. Her hands, the same subject he'd drawn months ago in the margins of his arithmetic paper, but larger and more considered, with a confidence in the line that 8 months of being told his skill was real had built into him. She kept it. She put it in the office where she could see it from the desk. Mara cried briefly, with the controlled efficiency of a woman who had decided she was allowed to cry at her brother's wedding and was doing it on her own terms. The ceremony itself was brief and plain. They stood in the yard of Iron Creek Ranch in May sunshine with the creek audible in the near distance and the mountains behind them. And Eliza wore the gray dress, because she had always loved the gray dress, regardless of what it had witnessed. And Rhett wore his good coat and looked at her the way he always looked at her, directly, without performance, with the specific attention of a man who saw exactly what was in front of him and meant what he said about it. He had promised her partnership. He had not promised her easy. She had not wanted easy. She had wanted real, and that was what she had. The schoolhouse went up in September. It was not grand. It was never going to be grand. They didn't have the resources for grand, and Eliza had no interest in grand regardless. It was solidly built, because Rhett would not build something that wouldn't last. And it was warm, because she had very specific opinions about children learning in the cold after a winter of teaching in kitchens and barns. It had 4 windows and a proper board on the front wall, and 12 desks that Henderson and his eldest son had built over the summer from timber he'd been seasoning for 2 years for a different purpose and redirected without being asked. The day it opened, 11 children came. By November, there were 15. By the following spring, there were 22 drawn from ranches so spread across the valley that some of them rode 40 minutes each way, which their parents permitted because there was a teacher worth riding to. Eliza taught arithmetic and reading and writing, and on the afternoons when the lesson went long and the mood was right, other things, the history of water law in the West, which she had become inadvertently expert in, how to read a boundary description, how to compare 2 documents and find where they diverged. She taught these things to 12-year-olds and 9-year-olds, and an 8-year-old named Tom who drew horses in his margins, and whose talent she kept pointing at a direction until it found its own. She was not a perfect teacher. She had days when her patience ran short, and her explanations came out wrong and she had to back up and try again, which she did without excessive self-criticism, because excessive self-criticism was a waste of teaching time. She had students she found difficult, and students who found her difficult, and she worked at both categories with the same methodical persistence she brought to everything. She was, she thought, a good teacher. Not great. Good. with specific strengths and specific limitations, and she was honest about both. So, 3 years after the morning, Eliza had stood on the platform in the dark with nowhere to go. She stood on the ridge above Iron Creek Ranch on a morning in October and looked out over a valley that was different in ways she could see and ways she couldn't. Below her, the ranch had expanded, not dramatically, but solidly. 2 new workers' cabins on the east side, which Rhett had built over the summer with help from Henderson's crew and the Aldred boys, now grown enough to be useful with a hammer. The vegetable garden she had planted in her first November, too late, Tom Greer had said, was in its 3rd productive season and had long since stopped being remarkable to anyone. The schoolhouse was visible from the ridge, small and square and reassuringly solid, with smoke coming from its chimney because Eliza had made a rule about keeping the fire going whenever children were inside, non-negotiable, end of discussion. The cooperative property, Warren's old ranch, now held in common by 5 families, was being worked by a rotation of the member property's labor, and the arrangement had required 3 renegotiations in 3 years as they figured out what actually worked versus what they'd theorized would work. And those renegotiations had been occasionally heated and always resolved because people with shared property had a specific incentive to resolve things that people with competing property did not. That was, Eliza had come to think, the central thing she'd learned, not about law or documentation or water rights, but about people. The instinct to compete individually and the instinct to cooperate were both real and both rational, and the conditions around a person determined which one got expression. Silas Vane had spent years manufacturing conditions that made competition feel like the only option, isolating people, weakening them separately, making cooperation feel impossible until it nearly was. What she and Rhett and the others had done was not complicated, fundamentally. They had made cooperation possible again. That was all. And possible had been enough. She heard boots on the frozen grass behind her and didn't turn, because she knew that particular sound. Now the way she knew the sound of the creek, and the sound of the schoolhouse bell, and the sound of Rhett's horse coming into the yard. He stood beside her. She could feel him looking at the same thing she was looking at. Trent wrote, he said. I know. I read it this morning. The letter had come yesterday. Silas Vane had formally sold his remaining Valley holdings, not to a single buyer, which would have reproduced the problem, but in parcels, in a sale that had apparently been negotiated under some pressure from the county attorney's office as part of a broader resolution to the ongoing investigation. He was moving to Denver. The letter said this without editorial comment, which was Trent's style, but the fact of it carried its own weight. The Valley would have a new set of neighbors. That came with its own uncertainties. It was not a clean ending. He's gone, Rhett said. The people he hurt are still here, she said. That doesn't go away because he left. No, Rhett said. It doesn't. She looked at the valley. The creek was visible from up here, a bright thread through the dry fall grass, catching sun. It moved the same way it always had. It didn't know what the past 3 years had cost the people on its banks. It just moved, constant and indifferent, doing what water did. I've been thinking about something, she said. Tell me. The documentation model, she said. What we did here, the comparative analysis, the prior claim research, the way we built the cooperative agreement structure. There are other valleys, other small ranches with the same kind of problem, not just water, but grazing rights, mineral claims, land boundaries. People who don't know what they're looking at or how to build a case from what they have. She paused. I've had 2 letters this year from people in other counties who heard about what happened here. They wanted to know how we did it. Rhett was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking beside her. You want to write it down, he said. I want to write it down, she said. A practical guide, not a legal treatise. I'm not a lawyer, but a document that a ranch family could actually use. How to read boundary descriptions, how to identify discrepancies, how to build a documented record of established use, how to organize with neighboring properties. She paused. Trent said he'd review it for accuracy. Of course he said that, Rhett said. He's been trying to find an excuse to work with you again for 2 years. She looked at him. That's an observation, he said, not a complaint. She was quiet for a moment. It would take time away from other things. What other things? The school, the accounts, Eliza, he said. He said her name in that specific way, the one with weight in it. You've been managing the school and the accounts and half the ranch administrative work for 3 years, and you still have hours in the day that you fill with reading because your brain won't stop. Write the document." She looked at him, at this man who had offered her a meal and a safe room and the freedom to leave whenever she wanted, and who had trusted her judgment in a room full of documents and then in a courtroom and then on a ridge in October with a marriage proposal that was honest about what it was and wasn't. "You're right," she said. "I know," he said, and there was a warmth in it that she recognized as love. Not the theatrical kind, not the desperate kind she'd been trying to buy with a train ticket, but the kind that accumulated in small, specific moments of being truly known by another person and found worth knowing. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him slightly, because she was cold, and because she wanted to, and because 3 years of carefully not letting herself want things had concluded. And what lived on the other side of that was this. Standing on a ridge with the valley below her and someone beside her who had promised her partnership and meant it. Below them, 2 children appeared running across the field between the ranch house and the schoolhouse. Her daughter, 4 years old and utterly fearless, and Francis Aldred's youngest, who had attached himself to her with the loyalty specific to small children and now appeared wherever she appeared. They were racing for a reason that was probably not explicable to adults and didn't need to be. She watched them and felt the particular thing she had been feeling in this valley for 2 years and had finally stopped pretending wasn't love. Not just for Rhett, not just for the ranch, for this place, these people, this ground she had helped to build beneath her own feet. She had arrived one day too late for the life she'd planned. She had stayed for the life she found. There was a version of this story where the train arrived on time and she married Warren Pike, and the life was smaller and more contained, and perhaps that would have been fine, decent even, in the limited way of lives that never get tested against themselves. But that wasn't the story. The story was a woman who showed up with nothing and refused to be nothing, who found a ledger full of dishonesty and decided it was her problem to solve, who taught arithmetic to children in a kitchen in December and planted turnips too late in the season and picked up a shotgun at 2 in the morning and walked out into the dark because the alternative was unacceptable, who earned every inch of the ground she stood on. The wind came up off the mountains the way it did in October, cold and clean and personal, the kind that reminded you exactly where you were and that the place had been here long before you and would be long after. Eliza Whitmore, Eliza Calder. Now, though she kept Whitmore in the documentation she filed because she had decided some time ago that a name was a kind of record, and she wasn't in the habit of throwing records away, stood on the ridge and looked at the valley she had helped to change, and thought about the train. 3,000 miles, 1 battered trunk, $17, 1 day late, and right on time for everything that mattered. Below her, her daughter shrieked with laughter. Hit the fence line first, winner by a stride, arms thrown wide in the immodest triumph of a 4-year-old who had never once in her short life been told to take up less room. And Eliza felt something break open in her chest that was not sadness and not quite joy, but the specific feeling of watching a future arrive. She breathed in. The creek moved below. The schoolhouse stood solid. The mountains were enormous and indifferent and endlessly themselves. She had work to do. She was grateful for every bit of it.